I'd like to thank you all for coming. Again, this is something that's really difficult for me to do, but I am nonetheless compelled. I'm here because what I see as true is not shared by everyone. I'm here because I am sick and tired of seeing press releases and advertisements in the guise of science in the place of real news. I'm here because I believe the American media has not done its job. And I've asked you guys to be here because you're my friends and friends of friends in the entertainment business. The business that really helped blow this thing out of the water. Without our involvement, this wouldn't be the largest, most funded public relations scare campaign in history. So we're here to just talk informally with people who know what they're talking about, with different people from different parts of the world. One of the things I notice is that no matter where you go, in England, in Australia, people have these same reservations, but they're not covered. So before I take too much time, I want to talk about who's here today. I think they have a lot to say, so I don't want to pontificate. So we have Paul Philpott, we have Sean Current, Christine Majori, and Carrie Mullis. And if you look at your programs, you can read about them. They're extraordinary individuals who I would like for them to share their experiences, their backgrounds. First, let's meet Sean Current, a young man who I heard speak for HEAL, the group that we're here working with, who has been an activist. I think it's fitting that we start with Sean because this whole thing started in the gay community, and he's been openly gay since 17, and basically, I believe, done all the right things until he found out this information. I'm just going to give it over to Sean. I'd like you to basically to share. I feel really awkward that this is so large, but bear with us. Share with us how you got involved, who you are, in your own words, and we'll be about 15 minutes or so.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming on a beautiful Saturday afternoon and taking the time out of your day to come and listen to us. Boy, I tell you, coming up to this event today from San Diego was difficult because each and every time is a coming out process for me. And as Isai said, I did do activist work for AIDS for a long, long time, and now I'm on the other side of the fence, and it's not a good side of the fence, to be quite honest with you. But I'll just kind of be brief in terms of establishing some sort of credibility for you so you know who I am and why you might want to hear something that I have to say on this issue. In 1988, I was diagnosed positive with HIV. I don't call, and I hesitate saying that primarily because I don't call it a diagnosis anymore. At the time, I definitely truly believed in the diagnosis and the ramifications of what that would mean to my life. Now I definitely call it a misdiagnosis because each and every one of the tests, as far as I'm concerned, is just that. It's faulty. But I think that there are people on our panel that will go into more detail technically on that stuff. For me, it's about my personal life, living at the time as a person living with HIV, oftentimes called a person with AIDS. I've been living with this for nearly 10 years now. I've never been sick. I definitely have gone through several periods of times where I would be classified technically as AIDS, and then other times when I was back to HIV positive again. It just depended on how they changed their definition at the time. I stand before you not even knowing whether I actually have AIDS or whether I actually have HIV. So, but my real involvement with the dissenting side of this started in Provincetown, Massachusetts. In 1994, I moved to Cape Cod, had gone up for a summer, ended up staying and living in Cape Cod. And if you're not familiar with Cape Cod, Provincetown in particular, it's a very small seaside community with a large gay population for its size, 50% gay. It also is one of the oldest established AIDS organizations or AIDS communities in the United States, well, in the world. Some of the first AIDS service organizations were started there, and some of the first actual AIDS drug activism began in Provincetown. And kind of in an irony, years later, I stand here knowing that a lot of the work that I did brought a lot of these extremely toxic drugs to the people that I loved that killed them. Maybe this is penance, I suppose, standing up here talking today. I know that they hear it, and I know that that's what matters to me. But in 1994, I became the administrator of the Provincetown Positive People with AIDS Coalition. And it's important to know that the coalition was really just, well, a People with AIDS coalition. I had a board of directors. Each and every one of them were HIV positive or in some state of an AIDS diagnosis. We received most of our funding from community service work, and a small amount came from another larger AIDS group in Boston. And that's where my trouble began. Part of my responsibility with the coalition was to provide, to edit the newsletter that we published internationally, primarily in the States, but in a couple of other countries. So we got to at least call it international that way. And this coalition's mission was to provide information for people living with HIV or AIDS so that they could make an informed choice about their health care treatment and the options that were available to them at this time. And of course, this started out in a grassroots movement in the late 80s with Michael Callan, who was at that time the longest known survivor of AIDS. So the coalition began, like I said, as a grassroots organization and developed into a much larger responsive community and national advocacy group, primarily. Part of the responsibility also within that job was to provide, keep an ongoing library available to all of our people who use the office. We didn't really call them clients, but, and again, the idea was self-empowerment of the individual. And part of my researching information, pulling in new information, and updating all of our files for all of this, the medical approach, the alternative approach, I started running into stuff on the completely opposite end of the spectrum. And for me, I felt it fell within our parameters to have this information available. And I'm speaking specifically about Peter Duesberg at the time and many of the articles that he had written. And I have to say, at the time, I considered Peter Duesberg a quack. And I felt, you know, I towed the party line with the gay community and felt that what he had to say was extremely homophobic because I wasn't willing to think for myself at that time. So I delved into some of the stuff that Peter had to say, and it led me into all kinds of other areas. And in the process of gathering this information, I contacted a lot of the other AIDS service organizations throughout the country, and I kept getting the doors closed on me when I started bringing this up. The phone would be hung up. And at the time, I guess I didn't really consider it to be too much of an issue. I was still pretty closeted about this information. And eventually, I approached my board of directors and asked to publish a lot of this information in our newsletter. And it took quite a while to actually get that approval. And when I did, the ramifications from our small little newsletter that went out across the country came in very quick and very heavy on a very small little AIDS organization. Primarily, we lost immediately the funding that we received from the AIDS Action Committee in Boston. I was suddenly a dangerous individual, and I was threatening people's lives, and the information that I was disseminating was considered extremely dangerous, and that it should not be allowed, and it wouldn't be looked upon favorably by the AIDS Action Committee. Well, that's the point that I decided that I could no longer work in that kind of a situation. Again, now, it's important to me to explain that during all this time, I had, even in the beginning of when I was first diagnosed, I had this belief in my mind that this doesn't necessarily have to be fatal, you know. Maybe I can deal with this, I'm not getting sick. But the entire time I also spent all my energies looking for something that was killing me. And that was the influence of the AIDS stink, as it's called by some of us now. A diagnosis of HIV positive totally changes your entire life. Not just for the reasons that perhaps a lot of you think. But I primarily am here today because it doesn't go away. Even when you know or truly believe that the truth is not what you're told, it never goes away. My most recent personal experience has to deal with the medical community. Again, I haven't been sick. My AIDS diagnosis at different times primarily refers to just being HIV positive, and at some point my T cells would go below a certain level. But I've never had an opportunistic infection. Well, I was reading the brochure today about my life, and it said that I was diagnosed with lymphadenopathy, which is swollen glands, and I had forgotten about that because, yeah, that was true. That was true in 1988. And it lasted for a while, but that went away by itself with no medicines or whatever many years ago. So I had forgotten that I had even had that diagnosis. But as I said, when I published this newsletter and lost funding for the coalition and forced my board of directors into an established fight on this issue, I decided that I could no longer work in this field. And again, at the time, I was one of the AIDS educators. I went out and I spoke to schools on safe sex and what you need to be aware of and how you should avoid being exposed to HIV. I had the entire party line. When I left Massachusetts, I came to California to get away from all of this. And I somehow got affiliated with the HEAL LA group, which, by the way, I've talked and dealt with a lot of the HEAL groups throughout the United States, and this group here is by far the most dynamic and successful of all the HEAL groups. So you're very fortunate to live in an area so close to this information and have incredible access to it if it's what you choose to seek out. And I can only say what a great job they continue to do every time I hear that what the HEAL LA group is up to. It's amazing. A lot of the other groups are still stuck in the blacklisting that occurs in this. I'm sure it must have been some sort of a risk for each and every one of you to come here today on some level. And that's an individual for all of us, but I think that it's a common bond for all of us here, that fear that has to be present when this issue is going to be addressed. More recently in San Diego, I decided that I was going to go deal with a physician for well, a minor little thing, and I'm not so sure I want to go in. It's kind of personal, but it was nothing that anybody doesn't have a problem with from some time in their life, at some time in their life. And in my naivete, I went in as a gay male into an HMO system. And from that point on, I was blacklisted inside the system and they tried to pigeonhole me. When it was, the physician that I was seeing at the time examined me, he decided he wanted me to do an AIDS test because I was gay. And he flat out said that that's why. I asked him, well, why do you want me to do the HIV test? And he said, well, you're a gay male. You should do this routinely. And when was the last time you'd done it? And I had told him 9 years ago or whatever. He felt that was a little too long. But I didn't tell him the results of it at the time. I didn't feel it was necessary or pertinent. When I told him that I refused to take the test and that I wasn't willing to pursue that approach, and I was in for a simple problem that had nothing whatsoever to do with that, he felt that he could no longer see me, and he wanted me to see another physician who was part of the ad hoc HIV advisory committee to Sharp Reese Steely. I'm like, okay, fine. So I went and met with this physician who again approached the same subject. I understand you don't want to take the test. I explained to him why. Well, we have so much that's available to you now, but I'm not sick. But we still, protease inhibitors, you need to get on these things, and you need to get on cocktails, and all this stuff. And I'm like, but I'm in here for something totally unrelated. I don't mean to be so vague. All right, it was hemorrhoids, okay. But, at that point, I'm sitting there with this physician, and I'm telling him, this is not related. And even if, well, of course, and he tried that same approach. And I said, but then if that's the case, then I will pursue that avenue with a physician of my own choosing who deals with that, HIV. I'm in here for something completely different. Can you just take care of it? And he refused, and I was advised in letter by Sharp Reese Steely that I should seek medical care elsewhere because I was not willing to follow and comply to a protocol that was established by a group of doctors. I, of course, at that point immediately left the HMO system and went into a PPO where I had to spend more money, but I found out that it gave me more choice. And I immediately went to a physician for the problem as a straight male who had been married and who was divorced. He never, ever, ever brought up HIV or AIDS. When I, by the way, was seeing that other doctor, I mentioned to him that if my brother, who was straight and married and had children, had come in with the same hemorrhoids, he would not be requiring or expecting some kind of an HIV test from him. And in my experience in Provincetown for those 3 to 4 years administrating and serving in that HIV community, I can assure you that when it comes down to a test result, that somewhere along the borderline, where you live affects the result. And I've seen that happen because I've had friends take it different directions and come up positive and negative within the same month. And I highly doubt that it was a simple exposure somewhere in between that time period. I've also had many friends who've gone in and gotten positive test results and them responding, well, you know, I don't consider this a death sentence. You know, it's okay. I took this test. I was just curious to see what would happen. It went this way. I don't consider it a death sentence. And they were quite patronizingly told, well, it's good that you think that, you know. And that's where you begin in the HIV. You're exited off the main highway into a ghetto that you can't escape from. I'm here again today, and I spoke in Seattle in April because I want this out of my life. And it doesn't go away. I have to lie. I've been out since I was 17. I was out in the United States Army. I have never, ever lied since I was 17 years old about being a homosexual, about being gay, whatever you want to call it, until recently in San Diego to go to a doctor for hemorrhoids. And that's where we're at. There is a blacklist out there, and I'm sure that this audience is very familiar with that type of behavior. So I'm hoping that throughout the course of this afternoon, we can kind of keep in mind, well, first of all, the stories that we're hopefully each going to express here about how we've been received by our own communities when this issue is brought up. As a gay male now, I don't discuss this in any of the gay community groups, any of the activities, because it's not well received. And the deeper a person is into the AIDS establishment. I hate to use dissident words because I don't like the word dissident. I am a dissenter, but I don't feel that dissident implies dissenting from the truth, and I don't believe that I dissent from the truth in any way, shape, or form. And that is an important point too. There's a difference between fact and knowing, and a difference between belief and faith. And in my experience with the many people who were living and dying with HIV and AIDS, belief was the only thing that kept them putting the pills in their mouth, even though they knew that it was making them sick. One of my dear friends, at the time of his death, was taking 14 different medications. 4 antidepressants, one for depression itself, and the other 3 were for the side effects of other drugs that he was taking. He routinely had blood transfusions every month, which are extremely immunosuppressive in and of themselves. He took medications in order to thin his blood. He took medications in order to prevent constipation. He also had medicine to prevent diarrhea. I don't know how they figured that one out. When I approached his mother on the issue about 6 months before he died, she and I were very, very honest, or let me put it this way, she was very honest and I was very afraid. And I look back on that time in my life when I could have told his mother that she had to help him stop these meds or he's going to die, but I was too afraid to say it. I didn't want to tell a mother that. And Paul consequently died. I've had many friends commit suicide because they didn't want to die, though they were completely healthy at the time. I mean, I'm sure we all have our stories similar to this too. So I'm probably not telling anybody anything new. Somewhere in the back of all of our minds, we must have that question that's nagging at us. Can all these medicines be that healthy for a person? In 1988, when I was first diagnosed, I had a T-cell count at the time, when I did T-cell counts, of 985. And the doctor immediately prescribed me AZT. And I asked him, well, what is AZT? I don't know, but that's what they're telling us to give you. So I said, okay, well, I'll take this drug and I'll go find out. And ironically, it was Project Inform of San Francisco, Martin Delaney himself, who informed me what AZT did and the toxic effects of it. I took AZT for a month and a half, and again, not having any health problems. Oh, yeah, I had swollen lymph glands, that's right, which never went away from AZT, I have to remind you. And I got extremely sick within a month and a half, and I threw it away when I found out that it destroyed the bone marrow. But none of the physicians were willing to tell me that. None of the physicians were willing to tell me that it came with a toxic symbol on its label. My belief at the time was, well, I'll wait until I need it later, because I feel a lot better without taking this drug. But you have to ask yourself at some point along the line, you know, if Bactrim, a prophylaxis medication for pneumonia, causes diarrhea in almost everyone who takes it, how healthy can this be? And it still doesn't prevent PCP pneumonia in most people. Many people are still diagnosed, although kind of an arbitrary diagnosis. They're not as strict with how they diagnose PCP nowadays, but many people still are diagnosed PCP pneumonia positive, I guess, while taking Bactrim. So what's the point of taking this drug? In my experience at the Coalition, I advised a lot of friends to stop taking Bactrim because they would come in with recent bouts of diarrhea. And I would ask them questions like, well, did you start new meds recently? Well, I started Bactrim. And after explaining to them and showing them from the physician's desk reference all the destructive side effects, poisonings, there's no such thing as a side effect, but all the destructive effects of the Bactrim, they would, in some cases, be willing to stop it for at least 2 weeks, and the diarrhea would go away and they'd feel good again. But there was always that fear for them. What am I doing? Is this wrong? Have I made the wrong choice? You know, this could be destructive, and then they would begin the Bactrim again, which, by the way, is strictly referred to in the PDR as a medication that should only be taken for 2 weeks, usually tops 3 weeks for anybody, and it's prescribed for ongoing, you know, periods of time. I know people that have taken it for more than a year, and no one seems to question that. And at some point, I hope that we might be a little less afraid to speak to our friends openly about some of the things that we all kind of wonder about in our minds. Is this really healthy for you to take 3 different medicines when you're fine? So anyway, I hope that today, one of the things that we can keep in mind is this similarity or this bond that we maybe all have here today about there's something nagging at me, something doesn't sit right with this, you know, and I'm here, and I probably haven't told any of my friends that I'm here, and here's some people that have some stuff to talk about that doesn't sit real well, but there's truth in what's going to be said today, and I hope that it brings you back on some of these issues in some way, if only for your own personal lives and the lives of your friends. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Basically, I think what we have here is a failure to communicate, obviously. But what we have here is, I think, a suspension of the Constitution when it comes to something I consider medical McCarthyism. They use the words, this is dangerous information, and basically the way national security was touted every time that information that was not politically good came out, they would hide it under the cloak of national security. I'd like to introduce one of my heroes, Christine Maggiore. Christine is the author of that wonderful booklet, or book actually, that is being offered here as well. Christine is a former businesswoman, entrepreneur, whose life was basically turned upside down. You can get the short version of it on your program, but in order to save time, let's just get right with this. Christine, do you want to sit or do you want to talk?
I'll try to stand, but if the wind blows and you can see my underwear, I'm going to have to sit down. Well, I guess I just want to start out by saying that I never intended to be doing any of this. The book is an accident. My presence here is an accident. This is an accident. I started out in all of this inadvertently in 1992 when my friend Judy suggested I see a discount gynecologist, and it sounded like a really good way to save a few bucks on a pap smear. And little did I know that this woman would be a strident feminist and insist I do things like switch to cotton underwear, which I am wearing today, learn where my cervix was located, and take an HIV test. I went for the first two without too much trouble, but the third one I didn't really like because I'm afraid of needles. I wasn't really afraid of the test. I'd been mostly absent from the United States when the whole AIDS thing came into being, and didn't consider myself in any of the risk categories I later found out about when I came to live here, because I'd been with the same, like, way too lethal, boring to be lethal boyfriend for most of the time that this whole thing was going around. So I did it on the basis of being a good citizen, like recycling cans and voting. I would take an HIV test and therefore do my duty and be a good person. So when she called up crying over the telephone and insisted I come in that day right now, I knew that something had gone awry in my plan to be, Miss Nice Person. She didn't offer me any pre-test or post-test counseling about this. In fact, she knew nothing. She handed me a piece of paper. It said I was HIV positive, and she handed me a crumpled up newspaper article of a woman who had gotten AIDS and started an organization, and she was really cranky and sick, and she thought that maybe I should call her. She let me go into her office and make one phone call like I'd just been arrested. And I didn't know who to call, so I called the lady from the newspaper article, and she told me I needed to see an AIDS specialist, which I did about 4 very long days later. I can't express the shock, the shame, the incredible shame of being told, because what this said to me in essence was I had been stupid, I had done something very wrong. If I would have been paying attention or somehow more aware and more informed, this wouldn't have happened to me. And of course, I knew no one with AIDS. I knew no one who had tested HIV positive. I was the first person I met that had ever had this happen to them, and I felt very alone and foolish and stupid and awful. I went to see this AIDS specialist, and he looked at my test and said, I don't think this is really a positive test. There's some question here. It's not strong enough to be considered a positive, but it's not weak enough to be considered a negative, so we'll have to do it over. He did it all over again, and at the same time tested me for everything from cholesterol to T cells, which are supposed to be a measure of immune health, and I came out a winner on everything except the HIV. He said I was definitely positive, and even though I was so healthy, I was the office record setter for T cells, I could expect to die of AIDS. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. And in the meantime, there was nothing I could do at all except he had some really ridiculous recommendations for somebody who's diagnosed with a fatal condition. Sit down when you eat. No more Coke. I thought he was referring to the soft drink because we were talking about food. And don't waste any of my money or time investigating anything like vitamins and supplements, because it was to no avail. I would eventually get sick and die. I thought the guy was a freak with that sit down, no Coke. So I left and began a search for an AIDS doctor that might make some sense. What I didn't realize at the time is he was talking to me as if I were the typical AIDS patient, someone who doesn't eat because they're always on Coke or crystal meth or something, somebody who was doing things that I hadn't done and had no plans on doing. But it took me a while to figure that out, why I was being talked to like this. When I left there, I figured he must have reminded me kind of my dad, because when I left there, I immediately went to the health food store where he told me not to go and started reading books about vitamins and supplements and things I might be able to do to save my butt. And what I started to notice almost immediately was that the things he had told me so far in just that one visit were being contradicted by other information that was out there. I mean, it was on the back shelf underneath a bunch of stuff at Crown Books, but it was there. And so I had it in my mind that I would search for a doctor who would put on the front shelf this other kind of information, that there were people that were remaining healthy, that vitamins and supplements can do things for your health. And I set off with that attitude in mind, and I went everywhere from UCLA to infectious disease specialists in Beverly Hills to the West Hollywood AIDS clinics, looking for a doctor who would look at me as an individual, because I noticed right away I became an impending statistic for everyone, and I was no longer a person. I was talked to in the same way that first guy talked to me, as if I were a typical AIDS patient falling into those typical risk groups. When I was going around to all these different places, I started meeting people, and somehow I got drafted into public service as a volunteer for AIDS organizations. I was still working full-time in my business, and I was also going full-time after work for a degree, which I eventually stopped doing because I figured I was going to die anyway. Why bother dying with a degree with all that homework you have to do? So anyway, it wouldn't matter when I was dead. Eventually, I found a doctor. Oh, wait. First of all, these people drafted me into these AIDS organizations. The first one was LA Shanti. I joined a support group so I would have someone to talk to because I didn't want to tell any of my family or any of my friends what had happened to me because I really felt stupid and foolish, like I'd wrecked my entire life, which seemed so promising, at least to me. And I needed somebody else I could talk with about this, and there weren't very many women I would run into in any of these doctors' offices, so that was another motivating point too. I joined the support group, and immediately they drafted me to become a speaker for support group facilitators who would come in and learn about the kind of person that would be in support groups and all that sort of stuff, and I did that willingly. Then somebody else found out about me and sent me over to AIDS Project Los Angeles, and they got me to be a public speaker and an educator on their behalf, which I also did quite willingly because I believed that if this terrible thing could happen to me, and I'd never been to Club Med, it could probably happen to anyone, and I needed to warn women everywhere that this could happen to them. So then I got elected to the board of directors of Women at Risk, and I thought that was an honor because it sounded important. And I helped them out with their various things. Their main focus was support groups. And in the meantime, I kept looking for a doctor who might have some information or a different point of view, or at least not speak to me in religious terms. We believe that the virus, they have seen. Well, who are they? Who are we? They never knew. But there was always these really strange explanations for things that I naively thought that, you know, science was black and white and there should be better answers, and kept looking for them and just wasn't finding them until, and I always get the same diagnosis anywhere: you're incredibly healthy, but you're going to die. So finally I ran into a doctor who actually treated me like a person, and she said, you know, you are amazingly healthy. I think we should do these tests again. So she ran the HIV test on me again, and it came out indeterminate, which sort of spun everybody because that was sort of back to where I was the first time I tested with the gynecologist, that it wasn't really positive, except this time the lab marked it indeterminate. So I hung around with that diagnosis for a while, and in the meantime I was really in thick with all the AIDS stuff. I was so popular as a public speaker at APLA simply because I was white. Well, I am still. I'm white, heterosexual, a business person. I'd never done drugs, and they really used that, and I was very good at scaring the crap out of people. I would go, they send me off to cheerleaders conventions, to organizations with mothers, to college campuses, and when I was done, everybody was lined up to hug me with tears in their eyes, and you know, I was crying too because I was going for the whole thing, and it was really weird, but I felt like I was doing something important. And in the middle of all of this, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who lived overseas and said there had been this doctor from America on television, and his name was Peter Duesberg, and he claimed that HIV didn't cause AIDS. He was located in California, somewhere around San Francisco, and I should call him and get an appointment. So I did the 411 thing and found this guy without knowing. He was a world-renowned retrovirologist. He'd been nominated for a Nobel Prize for discovering oncogenes, and had published papers over the course of several years challenging the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, and had suffered greatly for having done so, and basically the entire world was mad at him. I thought he was a practicing physician. So I called and left an appointment asking if I could come in for a physical. Yeah, probably. He called me back, and we ended up talking for at least an hour. And what he said made more sense to me than everything I'd been teaching other people and being trained to tell other people and all the pat explanations at the AIDS organizations, but it just seemed a little too good to be true, especially when you've designed your life around dying, which all these AIDS organizations encourage you to do. You walk in, and one of the first things is, do you have a will? Have you signed over your power of attorney to someone else for when your brain is turned to mush? Things like, have you considered going on disability? Well, I didn't feel the least bit disabled. But, that's the kind of way they treat you, and you sort of gear yourself up to going nowhere except, on a path, long or short, to the cemetery. So what he was telling me sounded very appealing, but I thought it was a little too appealing. And I asked him to send me his papers, and the next day I got a package like about this thick. And I just pored over them for days and was amazed that there was so much information available, not just from him, but from scientists and doctors and researchers all over the world, pointing out that everything I had been told, everything I had believed, everything I'd been working so hard to teach others was based on tenuous, at best, or extremely faulty conjecture, guesses, a prejudicial look at some statistics. I mean, it was just awful. It was like I started to think that if the evidence that originally created the idea that HIV was the cause of AIDS were presented as a high school science project, somebody would have gotten a D. It was that bad. And I wanted to find out more. So I started looking around and finding more and more outlets of information, books, people. It was like I became a magnet for people like Gary Mullis, just found him somewhere and was able to talk to this Nobel Prize-winning scientist who invented one of the tools that we use to assure people that, yes, they will die. And they just started coming out of the woodwork, and it was an amazing, amazing journey. During this, too, something happened to me that I went back after this indeterminate test result, because indeterminate is almost as uncomfortable as positive, and so I needed to rectify that. And I went back and I took the test that Carrie designed, and it came back positive. But then somebody sent me an article from a journal called Biotechnology that said that the test is a wonderful test, truly, but it can't be used in that manner to measure the presence of virus, and I should discount that. So I took another antibody test, and that came back negative. And everybody was celebrating. Some of the organizations were afraid I'd leave them and not work for them anymore, and it was a really weird time. And then I went and took another test, and that one came back positive. So nobody could explain any of this to me. Meanwhile, I'd never been sick, never had a problem, and was getting a little pissed off, to be honest. I went to the organizations that I worked for, and I said, this is really weird. We're telling people HIV positive means you're going to get AIDS. But we never bother to tell people we're giving them a test for antibodies, and from everything I've been reading, antibodies don't cause sickness. That's the whole premise of the vaccine programs that we so passionately espouse and tell people to get these, because they form antibodies, and antibodies are helpful things. Why do we tell people they're going to die because they have antibodies? And it was one of those things where somebody refers me to somebody else, and then eventually it gets nowhere, and they thought I would probably forget about it. And I started asking questions like, why are we instructed to call AZT an antiviral drug when there's no such thing as an antiviral? There's nothing that acts against the virus. We're calling AZT, which is a chemotherapy, and it says right big and huge on the label, targets blood bone marrow. That's where the immune system is formed. And it's got a skull and crossbones on the label, too, that nobody ever gets to see, that pays the pharmacist. But the side effects are anemia, which doesn't sound all that bad, but life-threatening anemia where you need blood transfusions. Diarrhea so bad you can't even go out of the house. Seizures, dementia, cancer, neuropathy. That's like when your extremities and other parts of your body fall asleep, but they hurt really bad. This is all caused by the medicines. Toxic to the liver, the spleen. Every major organ you need to stay alive is being attacked and destroyed by this drug, along with the stomach lining, so you can't even hold down whatever food you are managing to eat while you're feeling so lousy. And I said, why are we calling this an antiviral? And once again, it was, well, talk to so-and-so in this department and that department. I really don't know. That's what we're told. And also, too, they get a lot of their funding from the lovely people who make this lovely thing. So I'm sure that was one of the answers I never got as well. But what I discovered, and it really hurt a lot to discover this, I don't know what hurt more, the whole diagnosis and believing I was going to die, or the realization that all the organizations I'd been so selflessly devoting myself to, when it came to me wanting to know why, for certain things I considered perfectly reasonable, intelligent questions vital to my existence and those of other people, I was shut out. Eventually I was kicked out. And you know, this whole idea of AIDS standing for open-mindedness and, you know, the concern of these AIDS organizations, if you're on the inside and you have any questions that deviate from official policy, you see very quickly it is not about concern. It is about the opposite of open-mindedness. And it is a horrible, horrible feeling to realize the lack of integrity and the lack of honesty that these people operate with. And there's 93,000 of these AIDS organizations right now in the United States, which makes 1 for every 4 people that have ever had a diagnosis of AIDS. Most of these people are paid to do this. And I guess, quite frankly, most of them don't want to give up their jobs. I know it's very hard to look at a different point of view once you've adopted one, once you've integrated one into your life. But this is more important than being a Republican or a Democrat or deciding, you know, if the whatever, you know, social issue pertaining to I don't know what is important or not. These are people's lives. And I think that when you're in a position of authority over other people's lives, you have an obligation to be open-minded, an obligation to be honest, and an obligation to look at everything, no matter how difficult, and answer all questions, no matter how challenging. And this was not the case at all. LA Shanti Foundation stopped calling me. I accidentally broke up my support group and we started meeting at my house. I became a big problem for APLA. They didn't know what they couldn't really send me out anymore on public speaking engagements because I refused to call AZT a chemotherapy anymore. Oh, yes, an antiviral. It is a chemotherapy. Thank you, Isai. Women at Risk put up with me for the longest time simply because I was one of the only board members that wasn't sick, dying, or dead. There were 11 of us when we started out. 3 of us were not on any kind of medications. All the other 8 women have since died. The 3 of us that are not on medicines are still alive and doing well. One has 2 kids. I'm expecting one soon. And we're just all leading normal lives. The guy who interviewed me for the Speakers Bureau at AIDS Project Los Angeles had the same number of T cells I did when I was drafted into the Speakers Bureau, and he was dead before I graduated. The difference between me and him is he had started AZT therapy just a few months before. I couldn't live with just knowing that I'd gotten out of all of this. I had to do something to help other people. So before I definitively left AIDS Project Los Angeles, I suggested to them something that I thought they would agree to, still believing that there may be some misinterpretation on my part, believing that they were approaching this with an open mind and they really wanted to do some good for people. I said, well, if you think I'm in denial and Duisberg is crazy and all these other scientists are nuts, why don't we have a public debate and we'll put this issue to rest once and for all. We'll reveal this information as dangerous information, as you call it, once and for all, and put an end to all these discussions, and then, you know, we can all go on happily to die or whatever you people wish. Yes, 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 no problem, no problem. But once again, I got the, you got to see the person to see the person to see the person, and it never happened. Finally, 6 months later, I was told that if I were to start my own organization and then invite APLA to debate, that they would show up. So I got duped into starting HEAL. But then it became really important to me to have an organization that would offer a voice of reason and sanity in all this and provide evidence like I'd been able to find for realistic hope for all these people who had been wrongly condemned to death. What we do at HEAL is we give people a chance to learn the facts from unbiased information, which is not available at AIDS organizations, unembellished numbers, which you will find nowhere, and find out about effective, healthy alternatives to all the toxic pharmaceuticals. There is not a drug out there, whether it's AZT or Bactrim, that isn't harming people on some very deep and profound level. And many people simply, for testing HIV positive, go on 30 different medications. 4 or 14 is nothing. I mean, there's people out there in 30 different medicines, and it's no wonder they're all becoming ill and dying. It's just terrible what these things do to people. And the AIDS organizations do not tell them the truth. They sponsor conferences on these medicines, and every time, if you look at what you get in the mail or what you see on the street from these AIDS organizations, at the very bottom it'll say, made possible from a grant from Merck, Roche Laboratories, Abbott. I mean, there's a vested interest in operation here, and they will not allow other information to be heard or seen anywhere on their premises in any publication they make, however the publication pretends to be about being open-minded. They call it being alive, being open-minded. They're not. It's not about that. Recently, we were told, actually we were never told, we were told we would be published in the 1997 AIDS Project Los Angeles HIV/LA directory, which is supposed to list every single AIDS service organization in Los Angeles. It's supposed to be an uncensored, like the phone book. You know, the yellow pages now go, nah, we got too many dry cleaners, we're not putting you in. You go in there. If you exist, you're in. You know, if they don't like that you're a pet shop, you go in. They would not put us in their directory. LA Shanti Foundation will not allow HEAL information or HEAL speakers to be at their seminars called Positive Living for Us, in which they purport to present people who need to make life and death decisions with all the information that's out there. They will not allow us. They told us that our presence would jeopardize their funding, and furthermore, they were forwarding a letter to the Attorney General's AIDS Task Fraud Force simply for having inquired about that. It's crazy out there. HEAL is basically a DMZ in the war on AIDS. It's a place you can come without being bombarded by these pharmaceutical ads. It's a safe haven from all the campaigns that insist you must die, if not today, it's tomorrow. You must be on expensive medicines that compromise your health in every possible and humiliating way imaginable. It's the only place that you can go and find tools to work your way out of an HIV equals AIDS equals death sentence. It's the only place to go. And most people don't even know that we exist. But people whose lives depend on this and who are able to find us know we're here, and they really respond well and they care. In just 2 years, we've gone from 3 to 23 chapters across the country. LA's where a lot of the stuff happens to support the rest of the organizations in the country, because I am such a royal pain in the ass, I won't stop. And just, LA is a real magical place. You can meet people like Esai, and they do wonderful things for you. And the accidental book I wrote, which started out as an 8.5 by 11 3-fold pamphlet and suddenly evolved, sold more than 6,000 copies in less than a year, all by word of mouth. And also by me shoving it at certain people too, like Leonard Nimoy on the way to the restroom at the theater. But but it happens, and we can't measure our success in the terms that most AIDS organizations use with the millions of dollars that they take in contributions and donations. But we've got what nobody else got, what nobody else has at all, and that is people whose lives are forever restored, forever changed, and forever better for having known us, for having taken advantage of the stuff that's there. People who write us letters and say, I'm back in school, I'm back to work, I'm off a disability, I'm getting married, can you come? We're having a baby. And it's like, it's the greatest thing in the world. We've been God blessed so many times at HEAL Los Angeles that our sneezes are covered into the next century. Absolutely. But back to the whole, what about the person speaking here? My latest lab test says I'm positive for antibodies and negative for the presence of virus. Neither test is reliable for what they say. It's once again that name calling. Let's call a chemotherapy an antiviral. Let's call a test for antibodies a test for infection, and let's call a PCR test a test for virus. It's just, the whole thing's bogus, but according to their system, I'm negative for virus, positive for antibodies, which means who knows. I haven't depended on years for what laboratories have to say about my health. I depend on me and how I look, how I feel, how I am, how I do, and I do quite well. And, well, as you notice, I'm expecting somebody else soon. I'm absolutely not supposed to be doing this. And I just wanted to let you guys know what your good intentions have meant for me. When you give to AIDS organizations, when you respond to their campaigns, when you send checks back to them, you are doing this in the goodness of your heart, and you are making my life a nightmare. It took me more than a month and a half to find anyone who would talk to me about prenatal care. I couldn't even get the most free and open clinic in Los Angeles that artificially inseminates lesbians who want to have children to even return my phone call after I left 3 detailed messages why I was calling. You are making life hell for a friend of mine who lives in Ventura County, who, healthy and positive for about 10 years now, had her 2nd child. Someone called Child and Family Services and reported her for the heinous crime of breastfeeding. Child and Family Services showed up at her front door in a squad car with the police and insisted that her and her 3-week-old infant get in it now and go take an HIV test. Once it was confirmed, they had both tested positive for antibodies, mind you, which don't cause disease, and 70 to 90% of all infants born positive naturally lose their mother's antibodies within the first 18 months of life without any sort of medical intervention. They insisted that this woman baby be put immediately on AZT, a toxic chemotherapy, a terminator of forming DNA, a destroyer of bone marrow, and a cause of all those other EMIAs that I listed earlier, and cancer. We fought like crazy to try to find a lawyer to stand up for her. We found out this was illegal. We could not find a lawyer anywhere. We finally found a pediatrician who stepped in and just said, leave her the hell alone. And the town was small enough where it didn't get to be an issue. I recently got a call. This must be like attracting these sort of things. I recently got a call from a woman in New York who called me from a hospital. They weren't going to let her leave with her baby unless the baby went on AZT, and she found out that 3 hours after she gave birth that they administered the baby AZT without her knowledge or permission. But they were not going to let her out without, I don't know what she had to do to prove that she was going to give this new little life these highly toxic treatments. And we left it that she was going to contact one of the few lawyers who does work with HEAL. We don't have any rights because of everyone's good intentions. We're treated like social lepers, outcasts, can't get health insurance, can't get life insurance, can't find a doctor that will treat us with any degree of dignity or respect, or look at us as anything besides this impending statistic, will not acknowledge that we are healthy, we are fine, and we're doing this all without the medicines. And when we try to tell you about it, a lot of times you think we're nuts. You think we're crazy. You think we're living in denial. This is not living in denial. We live in a world of inclusion where we have had either the circumstances that have forced us to, or we've been courageous enough to include all kinds of information and let it challenge everything that we thought we believed and that we were told. But unfortunately, that association between I support AIDS, I'm an open-minded person, the organizations you're supporting are not. I support AIDS, I'm for compassion. The organizations you're supporting are not. They are harming people in many ways insidious and obvious. From the simple sentence of you are HIV positive to you must go on medicines, all they do all day long, 365 days a year, is prepare people to die, and to do so in ways that are expensive, debilitating, humiliating, isolating. It's really awful. And I hope you're having a nice day. I'm really sorry to have to be the one to tell you this. But it's like, you know, you have an opportunity by being here today to stop supporting that, to stop supporting the stuff that makes life hell for people who have unfortunately had a reaction on a very non-specific and a very faulty test for a virus that has never been proven to cause anything at all, that for 20 years was thought to cause cancer by way of sexual transmission, by way of contagious activities. And it was thought to cause cancer because it doesn't destroy cells. In 1984, some yo-ho doctor gets up there and says, I've got the cause of AIDS, it's a retrovirus. Probable cause of AIDS. Well, that week it was probable, the next week it was certain. The world, you know, came to a screeching halt. It was published everywhere, and you know, now people like me have to live with this, and it's awful, it's wrong, it's completely un-American to not be able to learn about this, to know about this, and it is so morally wrong for the people whose lives are affected by this not to have access to information that will truly allow them to save their own lives. And I thank you so much for being here and for supporting this. And what Sean was saying, it's always difficult to come out and talk. I take a particular risk that I wasn't taking before because someone else is now affected by my behavior, the little guy that's constantly kicking me lately. I could actually be turned in to Child and Family Services, the health department. I don't know what they would do with me, but I'm sure it wouldn't be pleasant. And I live with a fear all the time that because of the work that I do and the information I espouse, that some knucklehead will get it in their minds to think on me for having the gall to think I deserve to have a life and give somebody else one too. So I thank you for your courage and concern and your open-mindedness. I hope that you will take the information here, take it seriously, take it to heart. Call us if you have any questions. I think our phone number is emblazoned on just about everything over there. And thank you to Esai and Laura Shapiro for making this event possible and making it possible for you to learn about this. Thanks.
Thank you. You know a little bit more about why she's my hero. We're gonna move this along because we all want to get out here, and I'd want to get into a question and answer thing, which is really where, at the last one of these things that we did at Stephen Still's home, I mean, this thing took on a whole nother dimension, a real exercise in democracy. I'd like to tell you a few points about the next speaker, Paul Philpott. Besides being an all-around nice guy, a Southerner from Texas, and lives in Detroit. In '91, Paul began his undergraduate pre-med studies at Florida A&M University, where he was offered a position as engineering instructor, already had master's degrees in mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech, expected to return after his pre-med studies to obtain a dual engineering PhD, MD in conjunction with Emory University. Paul happened across Peter Duesberg being interviewed on PBS talk show and took this new information to his professors and was emphatically dismissed. He's going to be talking about that, about the fact that there is no academic freedom in this country for students. Maybe for professors, but not for students. Paul started Heal Tallahassee and began staging well-attended seminars on campus wherein he advanced the view that HIV was a dud and that people with AIDS diagnoses were sick from various non-infectious factors. Claiming Paul was endangering the lives of the student body, the dean of FAMU's pharmacy school banned Paul from speaking or posting flyers. Let me see what else. Observers from the State Department, Health Department, started attending all of Paul's meetings, and professors started tearing down his posted meeting announcements. Paul successfully challenged the bans and countered by placing a public debate challenge into the campus mailboxes of every science professor. None responded, and Paul decided to devote himself to the academic study of this subject. One other thing before he actually tells you more. He applied to FAMU's graduate biology program and was denied, despite a 3.9 GPA and a 1440 GRE score for which he qualifies for Mensa. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Philpott.
Thank you, Esai. Esai asked me to come and talk to you today and give you an overview about why thousands of physicians and medical scientists around the world, including the Nobel laureate Kary Mullis on the podium with me today, why they all think that HIV is a completely harmless virus and has nothing at all to do with why there are people in this world who are getting sick and being given an AIDS diagnosis. Now, you probably have this flyer that was passed around. This is going to be my overview of this medical literature. The medical literature is referenced on the table. There's various articles that are posted that refer to the exact medical references in any medical library in the country where you can confirm all of these facts that I'm going to be going over. I probably won't have a chance to hit on every one of them, but I'm going to start by explaining how it is that we came to think, so many of us in this country and this world, incorrectly, that HIV is a killer virus that is out to get the entire human population and give us deadly immune suppression. Back in the late 1970s, two technologies became available to medical doctors. One was invented by Kary Mullis, the DNA fingerprinting technology that became so popular during the O.J. Simpson trial. And another one of the technologies that's relevant here is the ability to separate different immune cells from each other and count them. And some of you may have heard of the term T4 counts. So in 1979 or thereabouts, young graduated medical doctors went around counting people's T4 cells, and they found that there were a lot of people in this country who had very low T4 counts that were in hospitals. And these were mostly men who were either gay or were injecting drugs, and they had terrible cases of pneumonia and other immune-suppressing disorders. And they thought, well, maybe there's a virus loose that these men are spreading amongst themselves sexually that is wiping out their immune systems. And since some of these men who are gay are also drug injectors, maybe they're spreading from the gay men to the drug injectors this hypothetical virus. Now this model, this idea, this infectious model of immune suppression, it made sense, and it was a viable scientific model that was worthy of being tested. But meanwhile, there were other doctors that looked at the same data, and they said, well, you know, these gay men who have immune suppression and the low T4 counts, they're also drug users. They just don't inject their drugs. And sure enough, if you look in the medical literature from the early days of the AIDS era, you'll find that all of the original gay men were drug users. Cocaine, speed, even heroin, poppers and designer drugs. So all the original AIDS patients that they found, they could have just called them all drug users. There was no need to distinguish between heterosexual and homosexual. So some of the doctors looked at these same patients and said, you know, maybe all these people are sick because they just did too many drugs. So they set about testing the different hypotheses, the different models, the infectious and the non-infectious models. And the doctors who were virus hunters, who were paid and trained to find viral causes of disease, what they did was they said, well, if this is an infectious disease, the sexual partners of these patients should have immune suppression, and people that they've donated blood to should also have immune suppression. And indeed, that was the case. They found that a lot of the sexual partners of these AIDS patients, it wasn't called AIDS at the time, but they found that a lot of their sexual partners did have immune suppression, as they predicted. And they also found that a lot of people who had received blood transfusions were also immune suppressed. So they said, this confirms our model. This is an infectious disease of immune suppression. And everyone's at risk, and we better sound the alarm. But the doctors who were thinking of this as maybe a toxicological phenomenon said, but wait a minute. The sex partners are probably doing drugs also. So this could still be a drug-caused disease. And by the way, I seem to recall in medical school learning that blood transfusions are immune suppression. So of course we're going to find immune suppression among transfusion patients. So there was a rivalry, these two different models. And as often happens in science, it didn't come down to who had the best data. It came down to who had the most finances. And when the doctors who were proposing this as an infectious model, when they went to the politicians and warned them about everyone being at risk of dying of these horrible diseases that these drug users were getting, there was a lot of pressure on them to provide these scientists with money. And the scientists with money, I found out as a graduate student, those are the ones that have the influence. It should probably not surprise you. And the other thing that I found out that Isai mentioned has to do with free speech on American campuses. And I remember in my history books there was something about a Berkeley free speech movement some time ago, back in the early 1900s or something. And it turns out that you can now say words like fuck on American campuses in the classroom and not be thrown out. But if you say that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, you can be thrown out. And I was thrown out of school. I was a graduate student. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my experiences being a graduate student in biology and making these claims and challenging my professors the way that I thought I should. And eventually had one of the rare opportunities so far in the past 15 years of the AIDS era to actually debate on a stage medical doctors. And only a few other people have ever had that opportunity. I think Kary Mullis is one of them. I remember a famous line when Kary and Peter Duesberg, who you've heard of this afternoon, were making jokes about some of the facets of what I think is a very ridiculous HIV model. One of the HIV representatives said, "This is not funny. It's not nice." What, excuse me, Kary? Winkelstein, a name unknown to you, but known to those of us that have spent hours in the medical libraries. Winkelstein told Kary, "It's not nice to be laughing at. This is a very serious issue." And Kary said, if you couldn't hear that, he said, we're not laughing at AIDS, we're laughing at you. Now, the question that I'm going to address, why are people sick with AIDS? I'm going to break it down into two questions. Can HIV explain AIDS? And I think that when you consider the medical literature, as opposed to the cartoons and comic books and slogans that not just the official AIDS educators at APLA give you, but even in the textbooks, they have cartoon pictures of HIV and a lot of unsubstantiated claims. But if you actually go to the medical literature, to the data, I think that you will only be able to, if you look at the data honestly, conclude that no, HIV cannot explain AIDS. And the second question I'm going to ask is, can non-contagious factors, can they better explain why people are developing AIDS? And I think it's very clear if you look at that data that the answer to that is yes. Now, when we look at this question, can HIV explain AIDS? There's three main points that I think we should cover. The first one is a fact that very few people know, including medical doctors and certainly the professors who taught me when I was a graduate biology student. They have no idea that this is true, that AIDS, 15 years after its official birth in 1981, AIDS has failed to spread outside of the official risk groups. And AIDS cases have actually been going down for the last 3 years. And that's probably news to anybody who simply reads the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Los Angeles Times, as opposed to the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association. The second main topic I want to cover in asking, can HIV possibly explain AIDS? The second main topic is HIV, believe it or not, has also failed to spread outside of the risk groups. Now, just because AIDS hasn't spread outside of the risk groups, and just because HIV has also remained confined to the risk groups, and hardly anybody outside the risk groups has HIV, those two facts alone don't mean that AIDS is not contagious necessarily, and don't necessarily mean that HIV is not the cause. But the next topic, the third topic, completely demolishes any notion that HIV is anything other than a dud. And that is that if you apply any of the logical rules of microbiology and infectious disease to this virus HIV, it flunks every test that you can even conceive that would implicate HIV in any role in any disease. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Kerry Mullis? Okay. Now, when we go into the next question, we're going to go into a definition of AIDS, which I think very few people really know what exactly AIDS is, including the professors that taught me back in graduate school. And then we're also going to go into some of the very startling statistics that show that there is people in the risk groups who have the same illnesses and the same prognoses as the AIDS patients. And the only difference is they're HIV negative, including most of the people in Africa who have an AIDS diagnosis. Most of them are HIV negative. And that is one of the most important and compelling facts that governs these questions, that suggests to me, from a scientific standpoint, that we really have to dismiss HIV and get that out of our head and start looking at other reasons to explain why these people are sick. Now, going back to the first main question here, the first point, if you look at the year-end reports that the CDC puts out, 97% of the AIDS patients remain in the original risk groups, and over 90% of them are drug consumers, whether they're injected drugs or non-injected drugs. Breaking them down statistically, 56% are gay men, 30% are drug injectors, and when we'll also go into, very shortly, we'll go into the statistics that govern the gay men who are getting AIDS, and it turns out it's a very particular group of gay men. Most gay men have no risk of ever getting AIDS, even if they don't wear condoms. So if you add the drug injectors and the gay men together, that's 90% right there. Another 4% are people who describe themselves as heterosexual partners of gay men, women who have had sex with gay men, and heterosexual partners of drug injectors. And we'll ask the question soon, Could it be possible that those people are doing non-injected drugs as well? Because the CDC never asked about non-injected drugs. If a crack addict shows up at a clinic and is wasted away and tests HIV positive, the representatives from the CDC, the physicians, and the other personnel will ask, do you inject drugs? And the guy will say, no, I don't inject drugs. Well, he's not a drug injector. He's just another heterosexual case of AIDS. 3% are hemophiliacs and transfusion patients, people who, as I said already, whether or not they're HIV positive, there's a high incidence of immune suppression among people who have blood products and whole blood injected into their bodies because those substances are immune suppressing. One startling facet in this topic is that AIDS cases have been going down for 3 years. And I remember when I debated these medical doctors back in Florida, one of the doctors put an overhead on the board to scare the hell out of all the students. And it was a timeline of new AIDS cases from 1981 until 1992, or rather 1993. And the line was going up. And I pointed out that this was 1995, and why didn't she put the statistics for 94 and 95 there? And she said, oh, well, I've been using the same slide for 2 years. And I said, well, did you know that AIDS has been going down for the past 2 years? And she said that that was not true. I said, did you know that AIDS is going down for men, women, straights, gays, blacks, whites, people in rural areas, people in urban areas? She said that was all true, that was all not true, and that the students in the audience shouldn't listen to me because those were dangerous, scurrilous, false claims. So I pulled out, and this woman was an employee of the CDC, and she's a chief, a department chairman of a medical school in Atlanta, and I pulled out the CDC reports, and I walked over and showed them to her, and she said that she hadn't seen them before. And these are the things, this report is what all the AIDS doctors at the CDC work for. Every year to compile this report, she claimed to have never seen it, and she'd have to look at it more closely when she got back to her office. I think I scored that point of the debate. HIV, one of the premises of the idea that HIV causes AIDS is that HIV is a new virus. Now, if HIV is a new virus, it should be increasing in the American population. In 1985, the CDC estimated that 1 million Americans were HIV positive based on the number of people who had tested and the fraction that had tested positive. Well, guess what? The fraction of Americans who are positive for HIV has not increased at all since 1985. Although it was predicted, I'm sure most people remember, all of these warnings and startling, frightening, scary claims that were made by very important and influential physicians and health officials that HIV was going to come roaring down the high school hallways and spread out into the suburbs, and it was going to get everyone. And we would start having a reduction in the population of young people in the United States, even, they claimed. Depopulation of Africa. What never happened. And outside of the risk groups, even today, almost no one outside of the risk groups. Christine Maggiore represents one person out of 1,000, one out of 7,000 people outside of the risk groups who test positive. It's a very, very, very low number. And it's never increased. In fact, the CDC just last year had to reduce their approximation of the number of Americans who are positive for HIV from 1 million to 800,000. That doesn't necessarily mean HIV is going down. It just means that they looked at the data some more. They used a more accurate approximation.
That was after a report from NBC made them do that.
Right. Actually, they withheld the information because they were worried that their AIDS budget, that the AIDS budget was going to be adversely affected. People would be less scared. And you should realize that there's only 2 budget items that have never that never get cut. Social Security, of course, and AIDS. Back during communism, during the Soviet Union, it was the military budget. Now the military budget can get cut, but never the AIDS budget because everyone's at risk. There's this scary virus out there. But even if HIV remained confined to the risk groups, you can still have an infectious epidemic confined to risk groups. So all those facts do is suggest that we should look elsewhere. Perhaps there is another explanation. But this third topic here, and this third main point, the application of the rules of microbiology to HIV and AIDS, it just eliminates the possibility that HIV can be considered a disease-causing germ. Very few people realize, for example, that for all the talk of T4 cells and T4 counts among AIDS patients, a statistically insignificant number of T4 cells are ever infected in people that have AIDS, which is one of the reasons. That alone is enough to dismiss it and go look for something else. Another point is that HIV is a very inactive virus. It's a very lazy virus. In the test tube, viruses go nuts. And the reason they go nuts in a test tube is because in your body, there's an immune system that suppresses viruses. You put HIV in a test tube, and it sits there. You have to try to stimulate it with some very powerful artificial drugs to make it replicate at all. That, again, is enough to dismiss it from contention as the, well, I would have said the Mike Tyson of viruses, but I guess now it's, who's, Evander Holyfield, yes, exactly. Another point about HIV that precludes it from further consideration, as far as I think any honest scientist would consider, is the fact that when HIV replicates inside of its host cell, the cell just keeps on replicating and living and going on about its business. HIV is a very good tenant, unlike a few that Christine has had. Another point that my professors never pointed out, and that almost no one except for people like Carrie Mullis ever noticed, is this concept of a virus infecting immune cells. That's not a novel concept. There's lots of viruses. All the herpes viruses, they all attack immune cells, and they don't cause AIDS. The mononucleosis viruses, Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus, they all attack immune cells. And not only do they attack them at high numbers. The average AIDS patient who's HIV positive has only one T4 cell per 1,000 infected. When you have active mononucleosis, you might have 200 or 300 or 400. You might have half of your T cells infected by cytomegalovirus, but it doesn't cause AIDS. And these other viruses, they're very active. You stick them in a test tube with some cells, and the cells will all die, and you'll be left with a whole bunch of viruses. They'll just keep replicating until they destroy all the cells. That's another thing, these viruses, ordinary viruses, they do kill cells. So how is it this lazy, non-destructive virus is going to cause AIDS, is going to deplete an entire population of cells, when the viruses that are very active, that are very destructive, they're very bad tenants, they have a lot of children, a lot of offspring, take up a lot of room and destroy things, they don't cause AIDS. And then there's always another point that people overlook, and that is that right when you get your new virus, your new herpes virus, your new monovirus, your new polio virus, your new HIV virus, that's when the virus has the best chance to cause disease. And they sometimes say, well, you know, you can get herpes 20 years later after you caught it. Yeah, but you get your worst herpes right when you get it. And usually the herpes causes its most damage right then. But for AIDS, they say this very lazy, non-destructive virus, it doesn't do anything when you first get it before your immune system has ever seen it. It's years later after your immune system is used to it and has already constructed a very hardy and effective immune response. So for those reasons, that's an overview of the main reasons why scientists around the world, and there are thousands of them. Another one here tonight is David Raznick, a chemist who designed protease inhibitors for I think 20 years. People like him and Peter Duesberg, who you've heard of before. We have a retired Harvard Medical School professor in San Diego who is also in our group, and also many, many other scientists and professors around the world. So that leads us back to the question, why are people getting sick with AIDS? If it's not HIV, then what might it be? In order to answer that question, it's helpful to know what we're talking about when we talk about AIDS. We're talking, of course, about immune suppression. And we're also talking about other symptoms like tissue wasting. And there's a few cancers like Kaposi sarcoma and lymphoma. And then there's also dementia, which is just basically losing your intellectual senses. Now, none of these, or I should say all of these symptoms I've just described are actually rather common among people who either have worked very hard for a long period of time to destroy their bodies with drugs and alcohol and fast living, or people that are born in underdeveloped countries like Africa who spend their lives never getting or rarely getting enough food, constantly having to fight off various diseases that they might, infectious diseases that they might get from their drinking water, and that are constantly taking a lot of antibiotic treatments and other very harsh treatments for some very difficult to control infectious diseases like parasites, which is almost unheard of in industrialized countries. The difference between those who get the AIDS label and those that don't get the AIDS label is they test positive for HIV, they call you AIDS. You test negative, they say, well, you just have pneumonia. Stop doing so many drugs. So if you look into the medical literature, going to the second major point here, the HIV negative cases of AIDS, you find some very startling surprises. One of them is the very first group of articles that was published in medical journals promoting this idea that HIV causes AIDS. Christine Maggiore, Christine, what's her name, who I've been staying with for 2 weeks, a good tenant, the second half of the visit anyway. She mentioned that in 1984, one of these virus hunters held a press conference, and he said, hey, we have found the cause, the probable cause of AIDS, as Isai likes to remind us the official language was. People like Kary Mullis, I think, and Dave Rasnick were a little surprised to hear the news of this conference. I was, I think, in high school, or just out of high school, and I wasn't particularly interested in AIDS, but I remember there was a live press conference that broke into all of the network programming, and this Robert Gallo, played in the movie by Alan Alda, approached the lectern and announced very somberly that the probable cause of AIDS had been identified. And the reason why scientists were surprised is because they hadn't read about this in the medical journals. And that's supposed to be where you learn about scientific breakthroughs. You're supposed to go through a process to make sure that your facts are right and that your data is correct and that there's no funny business, or we should say in AIDS, monkey business, because monkeys come into play here at some point. So that was the first thing that was interesting to the scientists who were witness to this press conference, is why is he going around the review process and having scientists review and look over his documents before he had it published? And they waited for the next, was it a week or 2 weeks later, for the publication of these articles. And what was in the articles is not what you would expect to find if you were claiming that you found a virus that caused a particular disease. For instance, you would expect to find evidence of this virus in all of the patients that had the disease. And that's not what was there. What was there was the claim that in a third of the patients they found this new virus. Isn't that odd? And another claim was that 88% tested HIV positive, which, and Christina's pointed out, testing positive for antibodies is not nearly the same thing as having the virus. And one of the tragedies of this whole affair is that Kary's test, the polymerase chain reaction, has been used to make a little bit of virus, a harmless amount of virus, look like a whole lot of virus. So these people that had 34% of them where they could find any traces of the virus at all, they've since incorporated Kary's test, his technology, and come up with this viral load concept, which a lot of you have heard of, which basically just takes a little bit of virus. It makes like the people in this gathering here look like the Chinese army, basically, is what it does. And so this pretty much undermine, as far as I'm concerned, the claim that HIV causes AIDS, because there's a significant fraction of the people that have AIDS in these articles that didn't have any HIV. So as far as I'm concerned, if you want to go and see if HIV causes AIDS, those are the articles you go to first, and then you don't have to go anywhere else. You might go and see if anybody else was able to come and find a higher fraction of HIV and AIDS patients, but you don't find that. In fact, a study that was done in 1995 by this professor we keep referring to, Peter Duesberg, he looked at gay men in San Francisco who had AIDS conditions, who had immune suppression, pneumonias, and other sorts of opportunistic infections, and other conditions that meet the AIDS criteria. And he found that only 82% of these men tested HIV positive. The other 18%, the same group of men doing the same sorts of things, the same backgrounds, a lot of them probably knew each other, had the same sicknesses, but the dementia or the immune suppression in one guy is called AIDS, and the same symptoms in the other guy is just called pneumonia because of the HIV test. And then he went and looked at the data where these same guys were asked about their drug history, speed, cocaine, poppers, designer drugs, and 92% admitted that they had done these drugs. So here we have an honest evaluation of data, and we have a stronger correlation between street drugs, which are very active biochemically, and when you take them, unlike HIV, where there's very little of it in your body, when you take drugs, there's a biologically significant amount in your body. That's why you're taking the drugs if you take the drugs, right? If there's not a biologically significant amount in there, you take more. So I propose that drugs, recreational drugs, are a more plausible cause of AIDS than HIV, which must simply be dismissed. And Christine mentioned AZT as one of as really the main drug, and those styles of that style of drug is the main style of drug that's used to treat AIDS. One of the symptoms that she left out, one of the so-called side effects that she didn't mention, is immune suppression. Those of us in this room right now that are healthy and HIV negative, if you want to develop AIDS and waste away and have pneumonia and have your immune system destroyed, take AZT. Don't go having sex with Christine isn't going to get you AIDS, as Robin will attest.
All right, now this is getting out of control.
But if we started taking AZT, we'd waste away and develop severe immune suppression. So you can look at the rest of the little bullets that I've included in the outline. One of the most startling is the majority of AIDS patients in Africa that are HIV negative. So now we're going to hear from the Reverend Dr. Kary Mullis.
Thank you, Paul Philpott. I just want to, a little introduction. Kary obviously won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for '93 for developing polymerase chain reaction, a technique that amplifies DNA, enabling scientists to make millions or even billions of copies of DNA, of a DNA molecule in a very short time, considered by many scientists to be the biggest advancement in molecular biology in a decade. A native of South Carolina, he received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Georgia Tech and PhD in biochemistry from UC Berkeley. His PhD thesis was entitled, quote, "The Cosmological Significance of Time Reversal," end quote, in which he argued that the universe is a balance between matter that is shrinking and matter that is expanding. Wow, okay. After graduation, he worked as a technician for the Cetus Corporation of Emeryville in the 1970s, during which he conceived and developed the idea of PCR. The idea was not the product of a painstaking laboratory discipline, but was conceived while cruising the Pacific Coast Highway from San Francisco to Mendocino on a motorcycle. For his brilliant idea, born at the speed of 50 miles an hour, he received, that's all? He received $10,000 bonus, which he humbly says they didn't even have to give him that. His discovery, his work, netted the company the patent over $300 million. They're very generous, aren't they? Bad representation is all I have to say. He has refused to team up with the biotechnology industry or academia. Currently, he consults and lectures around the world about cosmology, mysticism, mathematics, virology, and artificial intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, Kary Mullis.
Well, except for Christine, who I think clearly has been falling into one of the risk groups lately, the unsafe sex group there, to which all of our parents, by the way, belong. And except for her, I'm going to nail everybody that's talked so far. You know, Isai, none of that shit was true. Okay, and my thesis, as you know, was on iron metabolism, and it was because of I was working for the NIH. You know, I wrote a paper about the cosmological significance of time reversal for my own pleasure and the edification of my fellow inhabitants of the planet, but I didn't do that as a thesis.
I'm sorry, we got
You're supposed to work on something that they think is relevant.
We got this off the internet. I'm so sorry.
Well, yeah, okay, and there was about 5 other things you said about me that weren't right, but I can't remember them. They just like I can only remember the things that are.
Please disregard, guys.
Just remember that you know.
It wasn't 50 miles an hour. I apologize.
No, I wasn't in a motorcycle. I was in a Honda Civic. You know. Somebody went from Honda Civic. This is the way the news is. Okay. Somebody goes from Honda Civic to Honda to motorcycle to Harley to Coast Highway. You know, I was cruising around peaceably in my little Honda Civic. And my girlfriend was asleep, and I had nothing else to do but think, and that's what I was doing. I was thinking. That's where that came from. But those things don't have anything to do with it, and most of what the people have been talking to you about today don't have any goddamn thing to do with it. It is so easy for human beings with their clever little eyeballs that can see tiny things to just pay attention to tiny things and miss big things. Right? I mean, and this I think when Christine was up there talking, it sort of crystallized this kind of feeling in my mind that this is not a little issue about details of laboratory testing. It's not a little issue about what we call, like, what is a virus or what's not a virus and what is an infectious virus as opposed to a non-infectious. It's not anything to do with that. It's a really big issue. You know, it's a really big issue that sort of starts me thinking about people like Hegel and saying, let's see, how does this thing, if you want to find one good cause for AIDS, you got to look at some really big thing. You know, if you want to find one good cause for Nazi Germany, you don't start looking at assays for various organisms that were attacking people. You say, well, this is a great big social issue, really. Now, it can break down into little pieces like people have done it here, and some of those pieces may have something to do with the mechanism whereby man's inhumanity to man periodically flares up and is acceptable because the guise that it's coming up in is not so familiar. I mean, if we were talking about Jews being the risk group, everybody would recognize what we were doing, wouldn't they? If we were talking about blacks as being the risk group, everybody would know that too. We're talking about homosexuals being the risk group, and then, well, we say other people, and oh, by God, everybody is in the risk group. If you ever kiss deeply, I think is what CNN said yesterday from the CDC. Same thing. Ted Turner owns the CDC, I guess you know that. But, you see, those kind of things, I don't want to talk about that very long because I'm going to go, because that's my job, is to go right down to the little facts that we can say, this one's wrong, and this one's wrong, and this one's wrong, and therefore the whole thing is wrong. Because that's my job on the planet here. Okay, and there's 3 or 4 facts. I proposed the very simple experiment a long time ago, and I've done it over and over and over again to all of the guys that do AIDS research. And anybody here, if you think about it, you'll see how easy it is to do this and how it quickly shows, if it comes out one way, that HIV does not cause AIDS or death. And if it comes out another way, it says there's something to be afraid of here. Okay, and I'm not on either side, but I'm saying let's be sensible. There are a lot of kids, 19 years old, that get rejected from the armed forces because they're HIV positive. Some of these are boys from Montana that have hardly been around the block. Okay? Now, there's a list of those kids. Their names, it's a private list. The Armed Forces has it. I tried to get it, and you can't. And that's the way it should be. But whoever has that list, and he's a postdoc in Gallo's lab right now, he was in L.A., and there's other lists like this, whoever has that list ought to contact those kids and ask them if it's okay to check their mother for whether or not she's HIV positive or not. And what they'll find is 90% of them at least, and probably more, their mother is also HIV positive. They got it from their mother around birth. That's the way HIV and all the other retroviruses that we know about get around. There's one other way they get around, and that is from one of us to the other when we're not giving birth to each other. But that's a hard route to go. 1 out of 10,000 sexual contacts can possibly give you a 50%. If you have 10,000 people, you screw 10,000 people that are HIV positive, you get a 50% chance of getting it from them, okay? If your mother has it, you have a 30% chance of getting it from her. Now, if your mother had it, and she's still alive, and she was alive when she gave birth to you, and you're still alive and you're trying to get into the Air Force, and you're 19, how deadly is the goddamn thing? I mean, if you can give birth to a kid that wants to join the Air Force, well, if you're not dead, you might be if he gets to be a really good pilot and drops bombs on your house because he hated you, because you gave him HIV. But, like, that's information that could be gotten so easily. Now, we spend a couple of $1 billion a year just from the government standpoint trying to figure out what we're going to do about this disease. Nobody has bought, that's about a $100,000 experiment. That's all it would cost to do that. Because all you have to do is get those blood samples and check them, and you would immediately see that HIV is not deadly, and that most people who have HIV, and most of them are not known, and we don't know most of the people who have HIV because everybody doesn't get HIV tests. But most of the people that had HIV or have had HIV still have it, have antibodies against. Most of those people got it from their mother. All the retroviruses that are known go from mother to child. And a retrovirus that passed from mother to child as a way of being alive would be a pretty stupid retrovirus if it killed the mother or the child in 2 years or 5 years or 6. You got to at least wait till she's pregnant and had a kid, or else you and her are both going down the same tube. So retroviruses don't kill human cells. Okay, that's just like theory in a way. That experiment wouldn't be theory. That experiment would tell you damn clearly, without, it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, if the mothers of most of the kids who get rejected from the armed services because they're HIV positive, if the mothers are still alive and kicking, HIV is not something to be afraid of. And certainly not something to kill yourself over by taking drugs that will kill you. And I want to talk about drugs, Philpott, because I don't like the way you talk about them. Because we can't be stupid just because we all have AIDS. Drugs are what you call a drug. That's what a drug is. Did you see me eating those leaves? Is that a drug? Come on, think about it. Is that a drug or is it just a bunch of chemicals? It's a bunch of chemicals. It becomes a drug if I like it and somebody makes a law against it. Okay? Doesn't change it. The concept that drugs might have something to do with AIDS in terms of causality is just as much loose air as the idea that a virus might. Until you have some kind of really good data that says drugs cause something bad, then if you want to get off on your guilt about drugs or whatever, go ahead, but don't bring it into this issue. It doesn't belong there. I mean, Peter Duesberg doesn't have any experience with drugs. So there's something foreign to him. So like he's got the part of piece of Peter that's valuable is the part that tells us that when it is that there's a bunch of guys out there telling you stuff that they don't have any facts to support, when that happens, you got to bring that up. You raise your hand, and until they finally damn you as a dangerous person, they have to listen to you. You have to say, science doesn't work by opinions. I mean, really, it can be done that way, and you can make money doing that. But real science happens when people refuse to say things that they cannot substantiate. I will not ever do something as a scientist that if someone's interested in knowing how it was that I did it, this is when I'm being a scientist that's revealing the universe to people, not when I'm being a clever manipulator of human genes and making monsters for my own benefit. I might like to do that too. I don't have to tell you how to do that. But if I say this is true, and I know it's true because I've done experiments, then I have to be able to explain those experiments to any curious, interested person who's willing to take the time to let me tell them that. Okay, this is the principles worked out long before the 17th century, but they were really propounded again in the 17th century, and there's because of those rules that were laid down that science became such a clever little organism. That's why we have that thing up there on Mars right now. It's because we don't believe the bastard's going to work. We know it's going to work, and anybody who doesn't know that it's going to work is willing to is asked, come here, look at the plans. Here's why it's going to work. Because we've shown that this works, and we've shown that this works, and you can show it yourself. It's not that you believe it's going to work. It's that you know it's going to work. There's a big difference there. And that's why religion's kind of dropped off in terms of popularity, because it knows without having any proof. And year after year, religious dogma is the same thing. It always says the same thing. Science is a lot more zippy because your final take on things in science can change every time you get new experimental data. But it's that difference that really made science capable of doing something like putting a little thing up on a robot car on Mars. The Catholic Church would have loved to be able to do that. But they can't because they are stuck in dogma. Now, 90% of the scientists on the planet are just like the Catholic Church because it's easier to do it that way. If you are always open to re-examining your viewpoint and you feel like you have to carry around with you the justification for everything you speak, then it takes a lot of work to do that. And you don't have time to pray or whatever. But like, you maybe don't need to either. Now, the thing that happened here, I think it's great for Hollywood to be in Hollywood here. We think of all of LA as being Hollywood down in San Diego. If you can think of a better damn screenplay than what Gallo pulled off, you know, I mean, this is why we're here. This is why everybody's talking about this. Is why everybody's life all over the place has been wrecked. It's why it's because of this one little selfish bastard, Bob Gallo, having worked for 11 years trying to show that these particular kind of viruses that he alone on Earth was the master of caused cancer. It was a certain class of retrovirus called the C-class retrovirus. As Bob had shown, 2 little islands off of Japan, little teeny islands south of Japan, there was a particular kind of disease there. It was cancer kind of thing, and there also was this virus there that he hadn't found anywhere else. He hadn't looked anywhere else either. You know, and that didn't bother Bob. He announced that he had found the cause of one kind of cancer, which was supposed to help him get another $500,000 grant from the federal government the next year because he'd published something finally of all these people that were at the National Cancer Institute trying to show that viruses could cause cancer. He was the only one that had shown it. And the reason he was the only one is because he didn't believe in the scientific method. He didn't even think about the fact that you can't pin causality just on the fact that the two were there together. I didn't cause you. We're here together. What about all these other people, I could say? Maybe he caused me. Maybe all of you caused me. I don't know. But if I say, she caused me because we're here together, everybody would say, fuck that. Well, the National Cancer Institute did not say fuck that. They said, here's another 500 grand from the people's pocketbook. Go ahead and do it some more. But Bob suddenly got a message from his friend Margaret Heckler, who was the Health, Education, Welfare Secretary, friend of Ronald Reagan, who was tired of seeing homosexuals picketing in front of the goddamn White House. He says, every time I come to work, I start wondering if I'm one too. Get them out of here. Margaret, don't we have some kind of building down there in Bethesda where they do science? Yes, we do, Mr. President. Well, you tell them to fix it. So she did, and she went down there and she talked to Bob, and he said, I got it right here, and I also have these cool wraparound sunglasses. Let's have a press conference. So there you got Bob, and I think Alan Alda didn't. I think Nicolas Cage is better Bob Gallo, you know. Gentlemen, we found the probable cause of AIDS. Applause, applause, applause. And America, by the way, found it just a little bit before the French. As it actually turned out, because it takes a boat about 8 months to get from France to America, we hadn't heard yet that the French had actually found the virus sometime before. And Gallo announced it as though he had found it. Turns out he'd stolen it from Luc Montagnier at the Pasteur Institute, and that's now been straightened out, and Gallo doesn't get any money for it anymore, although he got a lot of money for it at first. You know, so we've already figured out, our own government has told us Gallo is a crook. He is a thief and a crook, a liar. And also they're saying, don't kiss deeply, because you might exchange Gallo's imaginary virus, which we believe in even though Gallo is almost dead. And he's been told, everybody knew that Bob was a lying bastard. Everybody who ever went to one of his meetings knew he was greedy, ambitious, and just the kind of person who might step down into some kind of crap like he did. You know, and he's already, you know, pretty much disgraced, except for the fact that he's got a lot of money from our government. But the government itself said, you can't have any more money from that, Bob, because actually it belongs to the French. You know you stole it from them. That happened, that was a court case that was not too long ago. Bob Gallo has been discredited. He stole it. He stole it, but he foisted it off on us, and we didn't think, well, it was stolen goods, man, and so we don't want it. We want to ruin our lives with his stupid concepts that they're not reasonable to call them concepts. I mean, if that virus caused anything, it causes a real simple word to understand. It means without that virus, you can't have this. That causes this, right? Well, that's a perfect situation for science to deal with. Well, let's just see if we can take that virus and nothing else and cause it. Okay, well, we could infect everybody in America and count up the bodies. But that would be a very, you know, not an economical experiment. So, but we can look back at what happens when people get it. You know, and looking back, it finds out it doesn't have any big effects. There's no way that you can write up a report that says this study right here showed conclusively or even probably that HIV was the cause of this thing, which is so complicated it's hard to call it by anything more than a three-letter word, AIDS. Is that 4? I guess it's 4. It's like it's the dumbest goddamn thing. I can't believe that you people are so stupid, you know? When I came down here, I said, I'm not going to Earth again. Those people hadn't got any brains, you know? But I was sleepy because I'd been taking drugs. No, I mean, how can this planet have that kind of mentality? Because we are the same people, I think, you know, that like, well, what did we do cool? Let's see. We have good movies. We do make good movies sometimes. And we have a medical system that's a huge dragon. You know, I, being a part of it, don't ever go to it. I don't care whether I have medical insurance or not, because I don't ever partake. I like drugs, but I don't like doctors. I don't like the whole system. I think there's something very scary about people wearing white things like that, you know. It sort of reminds me of church. And I think scientists and church is something you ought to think about, because they've gotten to be sort of the same. I mean, the Catholics pulled out, sort of, and the scientists have moved in. And the AIDS thing, and this is what I think, we're here in the nice summer air. Let's don't talk about disease. I mean, there's not something called AIDS. There's a lot of people with a lot of different diseases that have all been hoaxed into thinking that they've got this one terrible, fatal thing, and Christine sure has it, you know. And she's going to pass it on to the rest of us. And we all do have that one. But we don't have this other stuff, whatever. Some of us have bad cough. Some of us have got funguses growing all over us. I had some funguses growing on me. If I'd have been HIV positive, I had to turn myself in. So I've got AIDS because I got things between my toes. Then I got some spore knocks and it cleared it up. And so I don't have AIDS. I may have HIV. I never checked. I wouldn't either. You know, I wouldn't either. I wouldn't really try to figure out if I'd ever been a member of the Communist Party either in the 50s. I would have said, I don't think I was. And I'm certainly not going to want you checking it right now because I'm applying for a job. It's the same kind of thing. It's a terribly purgative kind of a thing. And it is, and like people talked about how the test doesn't work and all that stuff. But you know, all the details about whether things work and whether it all fits together, whether hemophiliacs really have AIDS or whether they just have an immune suppression thing, whether Africa is still afloat when it should be all dead people stacking up the last of them there should be stacking up the corpses of the rest of them. Haiti should have been totally wiped out. All of us, there should be 20 million of us with AIDS by now. See, all the predictions turned out not to be true, didn't they? They still have the old beast. They also still have in California, I think, an association, a bunch of goddamn bureaucrats worried about the drought, worrying about whether my shower is going to run or not, how fast, and all, whether I can get 2.5 gallons. We got those guys at the same time as we get federal money for floods. And last time I checked the reservoirs down in San Diego, they were pretty full. But I still can't take a shower legally. You have to drill the little thing out. They put something in there, right? That's the government puts it in there to protect us from being thirsty in the year 2070. But it's part of government. They've also told you. See, they don't really have a reason for being, do they? What do? Make up one. Think of something to scare people, same as scientists. They don't have a reason for being. You don't need them. I mean, you need some technician-type people. You need some engineers to make better stuff to work with, to play with. But you don't really need somebody telling you about the deep mysteries of the universe, unless maybe Carl Sagan once a week. But, like, you don't really need us. But you worry that maybe if you don't have us, used to at least, the Russians might get there first or something like that. They're gone. So then what are we going to have to deal with? Nature. The big threat is that we're destroying the planet, and you need the scientists now to tell you why and how you can stop it. And the plague is such a great little thing to pull. I mean, polio had worn thin, admit it. The CDC, nobody even knew what the hell the CDC was in 1975. And by 1980, their budget was definitely under review. And the head of the CDC says, there's a memo intercepted by the Freedom of Information Act, and this guy says, we need a plague. A plague is what the CDC needed, and that's what they got. And now they're already warming up the next one. They're talking about Ebola virus like it was something brand new that had happened because of the ecological crisis in Africa, and it was going to get us. And we have to be ready to mobilize the CDC, put their uniforms on. You know, those guys have uniforms. They have uniforms. They don't wear them, but they have uniforms. In fact, when that critter with the funny beard was the head of he's like our big doctor, the big doctor in Washington, Coop, yeah, he said we're going to have to wear the uniforms at least once a week because keep people reminded that we're Army. Those guys are crazy. I mean, they are. They really are crazy, and the things that they dream up are stranger than things that would make good movies. They're just, you know, this virus is mad because we've encroached on its habitat, so now it's going to come out and get us? Well, they don't have legs. Viruses don't have legs or wings or any kind of way to move, and they don't give a shit about us. And they don't care about their environment. They never heard of that. And they're just sitting there in some place, and they've always been there, and they always probably will, lurking around, but they're not after us. And we're not making a mess out of this earth either. We aren't. We're an arrogant little bunch of naked apes. That's all we are. And we're crowing about this horrible disease that's decimating our planet and paying all these people fortunes and taking poisonous things. I mean, we're dumb. Why would the viruses care about us? I mean, maybe they care about the whales. I bet you if there's any problem on the planet now, it's the ants. Okay, because, I mean, and I'm straying afield here, but I'm telling you, we're not just talking about the details of the HIV positive test or this pretty little invention of mine that fixed me up good. I mean, if you don't like it, it certainly set me up. I mean, I didn't do it. I had no idea about AIDS at that point. I was thinking about other things, but it did fit right into there, and I liked having done it, but it's like everybody else has got to have their own kind of thing like that.
Tell us how you found out, how I
found out what?
The blood work you were doing for the LA Blood Bank.
You mean how I discovered that there was no evidence that there was HIV?
Yeah.
That HIV caused AIDS? Okay, this is my personal story, but I mean, the general fact is there isn't any, and you can check it yourself. You can go to the internet, and you can say, AIDS, cause, return. Go on Alta Vista or something like that, bang, you'll get papers. The first 20 hits you get, out of those there will probably be about 6 or 7 that suggest that there is no evidence, okay? There will be not a single one that suggests that there is evidence for a causal relation between those two things. Now, when I was working down the street here, it was down that way, down toward Michigan Street, a place called Specialty Labs, I was working for those guys 3 or 4 days a month. And I was setting up tests to look for viruses like HIV in the blood supply for LA. And since there were so many people in LA, there was going to be it was a pretty hard to see how are you going to test all the it's about 1,000 bottles every day. So we had put a lot of effort into it, and we'd been successful, and I was having to write that up for the people who had paid for it, which is your representative government. And I was writing this little paragraph, and I said, well, I've got to explain why we were doing it in the first place. So I said, well, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. That was my first sentence, because I thought it was, because that's what I'd heard. And I hadn't questioned it. I just heard it. I said, well, if all these people think that's true, there's probably evidence back there somewhere that suggests it. And so I asked somebody, what reference, what little work of scientific reporting should I quote so that somebody interested in finding out why I thought that could find out himself? The guy said, the guy that I asked was the wrong person to ask. He said, you don't have to quote that. You don't have to say anything. Everybody knows it. I said, well, I don't know why I know it. I just know that I heard it. And in a scientific thing, it's a lot different from a movie where all you have to do is have a character say something you want to have as a fact. In a scientific publication, you are required, by the system, not by the editors of the journals, because they let you get away with a lot of crap sometimes, but you're required by the elements, the scientific things that have made it work, to always tell the person that you're now telling something new to where you started from. You say, I'm starting here, have worked to there. So we moved one small step. But if the place I started wasn't, if I don't even tell you what that is, you don't know we've moved anywhere, and you can't trust that. I have to tell you where I started from. Well, in that case, I couldn't find it. I started asking people. I started getting real sort of uneasy about it after about a year, because I still hadn't written the damn thing, and it was due about a month from when I started it, so it was real late because I couldn't finish it. But I started asking people all over the world because I started traveling about that time, because everybody studying AIDS wanted to use PCR. That was my invention. So I got invited to all these meetings, and I'd tell them how to do PCR. Well, I didn't care that much about AIDS to begin with, but I started caring after I realized none of these people, when asked directly, privately, sweetly, could come up with anything to help me out, and all I wanted to have was one scientific paper to quote that I could say, this is where I got the concept from that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I thought at that point that that's pretty damn significant, because there was a tremendous amount of interest. There were meetings, 10,000 people gather in Amsterdam, 10,000 people gather in various cities around the world every year or two to talk about this work they've been doing at our expense to cure this disease, which they've created at our expense, really. And not a single one of them can find a quote that I could use in a simple little paper to the NIH, that's the National Institutes of Health, that said, the reason you guys sent us $50,000 for this project is because HIV is the probable cause of AIDS, and it would be a good idea to see if it's in the blood supply. Right? There's no way to support that statement. No reason to do that work. It was all a waste of time, except that I enjoyed it. I love to drive from San Diego to LA twice a month. I made a living. And if you think about that, that's where all those guys are making a living. But I changed the question after a while because I was getting no luck with what should I quote. I finally said, when was it that you came to the conclusion? Because you must be, because you just gave a talk about AIDS and HIV. When did you come to the conclusion that HIV was the probable cause of AIDS? Personally, when did you come to the conclusion? And they would generally allude to some paper or something that they had read or whatever, but no one has ever been able to explain to me anything else than I heard it in the New York Times or on TV. Was that fiction or was that fact on TV? It didn't bother anybody to even think about it. I don't know how it is that we all overlook real obvious things like that. But you know, we've done it before on this planet. We do it regularly. It's expected of us to be idiots. I've got a new disease to attend to. I need a drink. And okay, let's remember this. AIDS is, in fact, I mean, and if you look at all this stuff together, if you've ever taken a philosophy course, like an introductory one, I took a bunch of them because they had girls in them, and that my chemistry courses at Berkeley didn't. So I strayed over to the philosophy department a lot. And I thought, this is the most useless information I've ever, you know, but there are some nice reasons to be here. So lately I've started realizing that this is really, this whole thing, it brings out, and from like Christine's story, you know, to Paul's, like, I'd say, he's kind of young still. The Georgia Tech boys, we're not, you know, I'm one too. But I've aged, you know, and matured. And so I don't jump on him. I'm a libertarian, you know, by nature, but I've become more and more so as I've realized how little I really know about things. You know, and it is not a good idea, I think, to try to find another cause for AIDS before we have found out whether or not the one that the world believes is true and which has caused them so much disaster. See, the cause of AIDS, supposed, HIV, has caused a lot more trouble in the world than AIDS itself. So the thing to do is to don't worry about AIDS right now. It'll go away, by God. It is going away, and it will continue to go away unless the government raises the ante. You know, they're paying $2,500 a year to every county for every AIDS patient. So there's a reason to have AIDS in my county if I'm the health guy, because it's my budget. Like if you think about how many AIDS cases they can claim to have in LA, multiply that by $2,500, and think about how many cars and stuff you can buy with that, you can see why there's an impetus for like saying, if there's anybody that looks anything like an AIDS case, call it AIDS. And don't you listen to Kerry Mullis. He's against the state and humanity and your daughter. But AIDS is going away nonetheless, and if we stop funding it, it would vanish overnight. HIV, however, is something we can detect, and people can make money for detecting it. And as long as when they detect it in someone, that person is pretty much cast into an incredibly bad place in which they will be injected with or coerced to take hideous drugs. Their children will be taken away from them if they won't do it to them. I mean, that's the side of it that we need to worry about. It doesn't make a damn what causes AIDS, really. But the question that we should be asking is, why have we decided that having HIV makes you our favorite Jew, nigger, smoker, whatever we want to jump on, right? You're the perfect one because you brought it on yourself while your lascivious behavior. Something like that. See, we need something like that because, by God, they took away all of our other things like that, didn't they? Those goddamn Democrats. You know, you can't call people names anymore, except you can say they're HIV positive, and you can tell your kids, if you don't eat your cereal, you'll grow up to be HIV positive, and all that stuff. I mean, we're using, that's the thing I think we ought to think about here, not whether or not AIDS is caused by it or not. But even if it were caused by it, how do we deal with something like that when maybe it's causal for the very few people that actually get it? See, the people that get AIDS are a very small group compared to the people that have HIV. It may be causal for those people that get it, but it may be that the rest of them just don't have the right chemistry to get AIDS when they get HIV. That's a possibility, which means that AIDS is kind of a genetic heritage that makes you susceptible to some virus that most people can tolerate quite well. That's an alternate hypothesis. Given that that's true, is it fair to stigmatize all of the 99% of people that have HIV but don't have AIDS with the concept that they are going to die and that you better give them some lethal drugs to hasten the process and get them out of the place? I mean, is that all right? I don't know. Maybe if you're homosexual, you should just be killed right away, too, because, you know, you might have it, right? You might have it. We got to check you for it right away. Yeah? Yeah? They didn't do that to you, did they? Or you just lascivious? So am I. I hadn't had one because I don't go to them. You know, you shouldn't go to those people. You know, you go to witch doctors, they're going to put a hex on you. And if you can prove in your mind that our doctors aren't witch doctors, then look at the definition of witch doctors and see if it doesn't fit. I mean, if you want to go to those people, go ahead, but don't expect them to treat you well. You know, why would you think that they're going to treat you well? That's a neurotic claim. We all know that lawyers don't treat you well, don't we? Do you come on? My lawyer is so bad, he sends me a bill. You know, he sends me more. I mean, he tries to take me for a ride. We know that about them. We know that about ourselves. Don't lay yourself at the feet of somebody just because he puts on a white robe and makes statements in Latin. It's not. That's not a good. It's not that medicine doesn't have some good things going for it. They've got drugs. That's for one thing. Sometimes those are useful, but they're not made by those guys. Those guys don't even know how to write the structure of those drugs. Those are made by chemists. You know, we don't go to chemists to find out whether we should pee at the right places or have sex in this way or that. You know, chemists don't know either. The doctors certainly don't know. I mean, we are living in a pretty weird planet here, but it shouldn't be that weird. It really shouldn't. You go to one profession to get the products from another profession. And the one profession tells you all that stuff about them. They don't know anything about them. The other one doesn't sell them to you. They sell them to those. You know? I mean, it's a funny kind of a thing going on there. A chemist who makes AZT himself can't go out and buy some to take. Same thing with any other drug. The chemists are making them. The chemists don't get to prescribe them. Why don't the doctors make them? Because they don't have the sense. They don't know how to do it. The doctors don't know how to make drugs. They buy them. And if they've got anything else, I'd like to see it. You know, what has changed? What is the difference between our medical people and witch doctors? It's drugs. Now, they don't make them. They have an economic way of like being the only people that can give them to you, and they make money out of doing that, and they act so cool, you know? But they really are a worthless bunch of bastards if you're sick. Okay, you want me to stop talking like that? Oh, okay. What do you want to know? I'm sorry.
I just want to say, at this point, since it's getting long in the day, you guys have gotten an idea. If you have any questions, if you want to open any dialogue, please do so. Please know that this is an open forum. That if you have any proof that HIV does cause AIDS, please show it to me as soon as possible, or anyone else here. But other than that, this is a safety net. This is something I'm putting out because I believe that if you tell enough people will care. Enough people are good, true, and beautiful human beings. To be honest with you, I am disappointed that not more of my own colleagues, actor friends that I had invited that said, I'll be there, are not here. But one is actually David Gray, thank you very much, and Krista Rowe. I mean, there's a bunch of you people, Apollonia, but there should be more. There should be a lot more. We should care about this because we dish this out unthinkingly to the world. And I think it is our responsibility, first and foremost, to finally go through this educational process, as uncomfortable as it is, because it's worth it. Because if what we are saying or suggesting is true, the implications are humongous. They're terrible. Then we are living in the belly of the beast, and what do we do about that? I don't want to take it sitting down. So if any of these meetings brings back one or two people, it would have been worthwhile for me to put them together, because one or two people is exactly what we literally got the last time we held one of these, and one of those people is Laura Shapiro. And I thank God we put on the event, because without Laura's help, so much necessary work would not be done, because Christine is pregnant, and Christine and Robin and the people at HEAL only have so much. We did not choose to ask you for money, nor is this a press event, because we think that the integrity of this information stands on its own. And at some point, you will be compelled to join forces in whatever way you can. At some point, you will be compelled to talk to your rich friends about this, to talk to your celebrity friends, to tell people, you know, just hear some of this stuff out. Just read this information. Just see for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions, any thoughts? Anybody want to share their experiences, or anybody have a problem with what was discussed here today? Yes, sir.
Do you believe that there is a rise in since the 80s in immunodeficiency syndrome, whether or not all be labeled under the blanket of AIDS, and whether or not HIV necessarily be the cause of it, but that certainly there is something that is attacking the immune system and killing people, or do you believe that it's no more than is ordinary or that has always been happening?
For one thing, I've never been able to quite figure out what an immunologist is talking about when he describes the condition of having antibodies to some foreign virus as being an immunodeficiency. I mean, do they mean that you can't make antibodies anymore? Do they mean that your immune cells are dying off? If your CD4 cells are in fact useful to you, maybe they're right. Nobody has really shown that CD4 cells are necessary. So I don't even know if immune deficiency is the way I would talk about the changes in the ratios of CD4 markers on immune cells or CD8 markers. That's what they usually measure. Nobody had ever measured that before the 1980s, and nobody's ever shown that that alone really has any kind of clinical significance. It may be that they just go up and down like the tides, and it's really not something to get all upset about. As soon as somebody puts a lemon on and says, if you got less than 200 CD4 cells, you're sick, and then they start giving you drugs that kill your CD4 cells, that could have the effect of making it look like it was a bad thing in the first place. But as far as what are all those little funny diseases, like Cryptococcus and Pneumocystis carinea and Kaposi sarcoma and those kind of things that we've lumped under this term AIDS, and also uterine cancer that's been stuck under there. Except for uterine cancer, which I think was kind of like a very transparent, like the motive there was transparent. We need some more women with AIDS, right? So that was a good way to get some women. But except for that one, I say all those other things, really, the way they came about in the 80s and the late 70s were as a result of a fairly experimental lifestyle, okay? What particular aspects of that lifestyle caused them, I don't know. It's hard to figure it out. For any one of them, if you were to really pursue it and say, I'm going to figure it out, why that one? Why Pneumocystis carinea ever happened? If you could disentangle it from all the rest of them and get some research funding to try to find out why certain people die these days of Pneumocystis carinea, you probably could. It's probably just another goddamn disease. It was a result, probably, of a type of a life that had not been lived too much in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and probably not much ever before. Whether it was the drug use, the lack of sleep, the poor nutrition, the tremendous number of contacts with other humans, and sexual contacts is simply the least of those, by the way. The gregarious contacts of any kind with human beings will get you the flu. Okay, most viruses do not respect the gender or the genital organs of us because they're such small things and so very seldom used. They go for our lungs. Okay, I mean, that's one of the first things they made the mistake. I said, why do they think it's just venereal? Because we don't know any viruses that are. And viruses, you know, they don't live here because they're fat and rich. They live here because they're lean and clever. And if you go for the genitals when you could be going for the lungs, you're a pretty dumb virus. Right? I mean, because we blow air out. You get in an elevator with somebody. You know what? The CDC wouldn't want to be saying that, but they don't have any evidence at all. Now they've said deep kissing. On the basis of one person. But the disease is real, AIDS, but it's not a disease. The fact is real that when you start having a life that pays very little attention to the stuff your mother and your grandmother would have said, you got to have this, you got to have that. You can goddamn go out and be a Democrat if you want to, but you've got to eat and you got to sleep. And they would have said, I mean, you stop doing those things, which a lot of people did. In a really a big way. And I mean, the people that lived next door to me in Berkeley started looking real sick a few years after they started coming over to San Francisco at night to the bathhouses. And I don't think it had to do with the disease they got. I think it was because they didn't eat or sleep. And drugs figures into it because the only way to live without eating or sleeping is to take amphetamines to stay at work and to take downers and stuff to go to sleep between 4 and 6. You know, and then you don't have much of an appetite, and you get skinny, and you get pale, and it's fashionable, and so it's okay. But that will lead to diseases eventually, probably, unless we're real lucky.
Also, in our history, we've never had the sexual and the psychedelic revolution the way we had it in the 60s. At the end of
Hopefully, neither one were harmful. I would rather let that alone. You know, we don't have anything saying either one of those things were bad for us. They were emotionally involving, and we see things like that big, close-up, and important. Okay? I think nutrition and sleep are the first ones. Psychedelics and television and whatever, and sex if you want to get into that. But you know, sex has been around a long time. Didn't seem to hurt us. It's in fact necessary.
But the combination...
It'd be bad if it turned out to be lethal, wouldn't it?
Isai,
Yeah.
the question about increased immune suppression, certainly there's been an increase in HIV testing since the early 80s. Right now, a third of the people who develop AIDS in the United States didn't have any immune suppression or any other AIDS symptoms until they started taking AZT. So certainly that's one factor that didn't exist prior to the 1980s, the consumption of AZT, which I'm convinced is a cause of AIDS and maybe the primary cause of AIDS today.
I just wanted to say, too, that something that was really revealing to me, I was at a PLUS seminar where I'm no longer welcome, sponsored by LA Shanti Foundation. And I was there learning about what it meant to be HIV positive, how long I could expect to live, and at that time they granted me 5 years. And this was based on a slide that we were being shown, and the slide information was gathered from something noted in an asterisk, which was the San Francisco Gay Men's Study. I had looked at that before I was at that seminar that day and had noted that the people who originally studied in creating this HIV/AIDS hypothesis were this group of people that had also been involved with experimental vaccines for hepatitis and had had many and concurrent venereal disease infections, had had parasitic infections, bacterial infections, amoebas, parasites, hepatitis A, B, I don't know if they were doing C back then or not, had not practiced good nutrition, had not done anything that would remotely keep them alive, and the fact that they were very, very ill, completely depleted, and on their last legs of living before anybody ever bothered to give them a diagnosis of AIDS was never mentioned until I raised my hand and said, for those of us who haven't lived like that, who haven't spent 10, 12 years on antibiotics and done crystal meth a whole lot and gotten everything with an idia or an emia on the end, what does this information have to do with us? And the doctor looked at the floor for a few seconds and said, absolutely nothing, because these are a very particular group of people that were studied to come to this HIV/AIDS hypothesis, and the mistake was very great in trying to say that everyone would become sick like they did, because they did a lot of things to make themselves sick.
Yeah. Also, another thing is, what we see on television and newspaper reports as the spread of AIDS is not one criteria. In other words, before 1987, they had a different definition. So that in 1986, you had more deaths of AIDS than in 1987. It started peaking already. I think people realized the lifestyle. They closed the bathhouses. And a lot of people started taking much better care of themselves. So in order to allay the fears that this thing would be going down, or to change the impression that this was being conquered already, they changed the definition, added a whole new set of diseases, brought up the number of T cells, and all of a sudden, overnight, it doubled the amount of people that were now considered AIDS. Now, if we keep redefining this thing, including more and more diseases, in other words, growing the net larger and larger, we're not finding something that's truly growing. We're growing the criteria with which we measure. So that's not, it's deceptive. Let's, another question or comments? You guys were saying something over there. It looked pretty provocative.
Isa, there was a lady over here.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that immunodeficiency in human beings, of course, exists. I mean, it could happen to anybody, not necessarily because of their sexual partners or a drug transfusion. But then isn't there, in effect, no cure for AIDS? If it is something like because of your lifestyle or the chemicals in the water or this or that, that has beaten down an individual's immune system, and I'm not grouping anybody, not a homosexual, not a drug user, just an individual that has had their immune system so weakened because of their lifestyle, then there would not necessarily be a cure or even a place to look for a cause.
But there is. It's in looking at the individual. Because what is called AIDS in one person is called AIDS in another person is a completely different thing. If you're a woman, you test HIV positive and you have a yeast infection, that's called AIDS. If you're a man and you test HIV positive and you have pneumonia, that's also called AIDS. When we're not looked at as individual people, we all get the same treatment, a toxic chemotherapy called AZT. When you're looked at in an individual, you get treatment for your pneumonia. Now, a regular normal person who's tested HIV negative receives pneumonia treatment, And they're told to go home, take a rest, take some time off work. They're not told to fill out your will, get ready to die, sign up with an AIDS organization, it's all over with, nobody's going to want to touch you again, check out. That's where the problem is we treat everybody the same. There's 30 different illnesses and conditions that are listed under the category of AIDS. AIDS is not a disease, as many people think. It's a category. Just like I was doing an analogy with someone the other day, housewares. You can't hold a houseware. You can have a blender or a dish, but there's no such thing as a houseware. There's no such thing as AIDS. There's only the blenders and the dishes and the pneumonias and the tuberculosis and all that stuff that goes in there. If you treat the person who is sick and leave alone those who have simply tested positive and well, there is no let's hope for a cure, let's wait for a cure, let's pray for a cure. The cure is here. And you can restore an immune system that has not been taken so far astray by the destruction of the bone marrow and the spleen and the liver and all that other stuff that AZT and all these wonderful drugs that AIDS organizations bring us and push on us. You can get better. There are many people who have and many people who stay well once they stop doing that. And you also need to, in a certain sense, get rid of what's in here, which causes a tremendous spiritual death. You tell somebody they're going to die, the lights go out. There's no hope for tomorrow. And every morning when you get up, I went through this. You know, my hair is falling. Oh my God, it's a cancer pimple. It's not a pimple. You know, you expect the worst of everything. And in this paradigm of AIDS, there is no way out. Everything is called a result of HIV. And I'm not joking. I read an article once that said a buildup of earwax is symptomatic of HIV. There's a young woman who called us the pregnancy stories. Again, I'm collecting them. This woman who called us who's pregnant and she just had her baby. We got her off AZT luckily, and the kid was actually born without the typical hole in its chest or 6 fingers, or had to be therapeutically aborted or aborted itself. The child was born and we hope it's going to be all right. In her subsequent visits to the doctor, she was told that the moles that she had developed during her pregnancy were symptomatic of HIV. I'm in a prenatal class out in Simi Valley. Half the women in there are whining about moles during pregnancy because it's something that happens. Their names are Tammy and they've never tested positive. So nobody puts this crap on them. But it's a very hard thing to live with. To be told that you're supposed to die, and to have everything that you turn on television and every magazine that you open tell you that too. So you've got to recover in 2 ways. 1, find a doctor that's going to treat you like a human being, and 2, get enough information to believe that you have the right to be here and get well because you can. Yeah.
Disease as anybody else.
Yeah, somebody who's HIV positive can get over their yeast infection just like anybody else can. Somebody who's got pneumonia and is tested HIV positive can get over their pneumonia just like anybody else can. The trick is don't get into the system that pushes chemotherapy on you. A cancer patient does not get chemotherapy every day for the rest of their life. Nobody here is going to get cancer chemotherapy as a prevention of cancer that may occur 10 years down the line. That's what's screwing people up. That's what's making the difference between getting better and getting dead.
I would also like to add, if I could, real quickly, that and it may be semantics for a lot of people in here, but at least for me, it's extremely important. I think that it's very necessary to be cautious with the kind of words that we use. This cure word is a silly notion that feeds us all into a path along what Kerry was referring to earlier when he was discussing, you know, why are you listening to the white coat and you're looking to him to do something. All that we need to be concerned with here is healing. And no more do we talk about healing. We talk about the cure. Be here for the cure. Well, there isn't going to be a cure. There's healing, and that's all there is. And I think that we need to be very, very careful with how I spent many, many years of my life trying to find something that was killing me. There wasn't anything there.
There's no cure.
And in that process, there was no healing occurring.
There's no one disease specific to HIV.
I was going to ask you about the virus that has been passed on to the children of pregnant mothers, of babies born to. Are you saying that the treatment that they have received is what has created AIDS in the
The babies that are born to women who test positive oftentimes will test positive when they're born, and that's because babies are born without an immune system. That's why the World Health Organization tells us that if women around the world would just breastfeed, we'd decrease the rates of infant mortality tremendously, because they would avail themselves to the mother's natural protective system, which becomes the baby's own for a while, through antibodies. So these babies get antibodies to everything when they're breastfed, and sometimes just through, being born and all that kind of stuff. When the kids test positive for antibodies, many times they're put on AZT and other drugs that, yes, turn them into AIDS victims and kill them and deplete them. If left alone, 70 to 90% of these kids will test HIV antibody negative within the first 18 months of life as they develop their own immune system. Plus, even if they don't test HIV negative after 18 months, it's not said that that won't happen further along the way. Many children have. There's a couple who adopted a Romanian orphan, and it took her a while to start testing negative. She's fine, but she was put on AZT for a while, and it caused tremendous pain. She stopped growing. She got sick. Her hair was falling out. The usual chemotherapy stuff.
She had AIDS.
She had AIDS by virtue of the prescription of AZT. But it's a terrible thing when we live in a country that says, if you're pregnant, don't have a beer. Don't take aspirin. Don't take anything, and stay away from secondhand smoke, but load up on chemotherapy, because somehow that'll do you some good. And it is completely wrong, and the focus of many, many AIDS organizations is pediatric AIDS, because it's kind of a safe, warm, happy little place. It's all about babies and stuff. Well, these people are slaughtering babies is what it comes down to.
Yeah,
it's really sad and awful, but that's what they're doing. They're telling mothers that they have to take these drugs, and these drugs are lethal. If it's not Thursday, it'll be 2 years from now, but the kids will suffer from this.
Based on, by the way, fraudulent studies by the makers. Again, we have Glaxo, welcome, Burroughs, welcome, testing AZT to check maternal transmission rates. Well, previously they were like 25 or 30% naturally. Then they said, well, AZT brought them down to 8.6 or 8.3%. And this is why my friend, the doctor, was faxing me this stuff, because I asked medical doctors, please, anything HIV, just show me what they show you. Well, we've got to put pregnant mothers, all HIV positive mothers, when many of them don't even pass it on. Now, what they don't tell you, which I think is unconscionable, is that vitamin A cuts it down to 7.6. Vitamin A does a better job at halting maternal transmission rates than vitamin AZT. But they can't control the patent. So guess what? You have to take the filth that they can make money off of. And I think, why aren't our politicians and media people talking about this? This is why. Most of them don't know. Most of them don't feel comfortable receiving unofficial information.
Not that you should be concerned if your baby's HIV positive or try to cut down on the rate, since there's no reason to think that having HIV is a bad thing. Was your question, why are babies getting AIDS? Was that the question? Sort of. Was that what you're curious about?
If it was the AZT that was giving babies AIDS in many
Well, there's other. I mean, do you remember crack babies?
Yeah.
Okay, crack babies were before HIV came along. Then after HIV came along, they started calling them AIDS babies. So yeah, there's a lot of people that have severe health problems. A lot of drug users, no matter what is causing their health problems, Carrie. And I'm not suggesting that you do consume recreational drugs, by the way.
What were those leaves you were eating, by the way?
What's that?
What were those leaves you were eating?
They're right up here.
They're right up there. They probably have pesticides all over them.
They probably wiped them. I was just making a point. With
these the people that are in these groups tend to be positive for just about every germ that you could possibly imagine. And if you look at the early AIDS studies, the AIDS babies were born to mothers, for example, that were positive for hepatitis A, hepatitis B, cytomegalovirus, herpes 1, herpes 2, herpes 3, herpes 4, everything. And then they come up with the new germ, HIV, and they're positive for that as well. So yeah, there's a lot of HIV positive babies who are sick before AZT comes along. But look at their mothers. They were drug addicts for their first, 9 months after conception. So that shouldn't surprise us that babies born to mothers who take drugs are sick.
There's a whole other insidious aspect to this, and we'll wrap this up as soon as I can, but let's just take Paul and myself. We go in, we get an AIDS test. They're looking for the antibodies. Well, what they're actually looking for are reactions to the proteins of the antibody. So if you have been exposed to those proteins, your blood will say, wow, I've been exposed to P41, P26, P124, and those are the proteins that make up HIV. What they don't tell you is that those proteins don't only go to make up HIV. They go to make up other antibodies. So if you have enough other things in you, you could add up to a total that looks like HIV, either fully or indeterminate. Now, here goes back to the test. Paul and I, we go into the AIDS doctor. He takes a test. We come back with the exact same results. Each of the proteins, like half of them that go to make up HIV, are positive, and we have the exact same results. It's called indeterminate. They're not enough, not few enough, not too much. At this point, the doctor refers to the medical literature, which says because of the test's sensitivity, we have to ask you questions to make sure this isn't a false positive. Mr. Philpott, are you gay?
A truthful answer?
Yeah.
No.
Mr. Philpott, have you had lots of sexual partners? Just say no.
Hell yeah.
No,
Oh,
just say
no?
no.
No.
Mr.
no.
Philpott, are you married?
Yeah.
Mr. Philpott, do you take drugs?
All the time? No. No, I don't take drugs.
Okay, now he goes into Mr. Philpott was a false positive. Now they'll ask me, let's just say hypothetically, Isai or dude.
Can I ask the questions?
Yes.
Are you gay?
Well,
okay.
For the sake of this argument, well, only on weekends.
Okay, that's gay enough. Are you married?
Well, no.
Have you been doing drugs? Injected drugs.
I used to shoot up. I used to take poppers, but
So you're probably HIV positive then.
There you go. The same exact results. If you're black, that adds up to it. You know, it pushes you. This is ridiculous. But this is what you and I have allowed to go on by not testing this any further. Is there anything else? Do you guys, is there any question in your minds about what we're saying about, I mean, because there's a lot we haven't covered.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
I want to ask this to Kerry. How do they misuse PCR to estimate all these supposed free viral RNAs that may or may not be there?
I think misuse PCR is not quite. I don't think you can misuse PCR. No, the results, the interpretation of it. See, if you can say, if they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. But the real misuse of it is that you don't need to test for HIV. You don't need to test for the other 10,000 retroviruses that are unnamed also in the subject. See, somebody that's got HIV generally is going to have almost anything that you can test for because they have definitely been. HIV is a fairly rare virus. There's only 1 million of us out of 250, 300 million people in America that have that virus. So you have to get around. Either your mother had to have it and pass it to you, or you have to really be paying a lot of attention to people that do have it and paying only attention to them and get a pretty good chance of getting it that way. It's hard to get it. But if you have it, there's a good chance you've also got a lot of other ones. Because you've been in the market for it's been possible for you to get a lot of. To test for that one and say that has any special meaning is what I think is the problem. Not that PCR has been misused. It's like. It's not an estimation. No, it's a really quantitative thing. It tells you something about nature and about what's there, but it allows you to take a very minuscule amount of anything and make it measurable, and then talk about it in meetings and stuff like it is important. See, that's not a misuse. That's just sort of a misinterpretation.
Even after all these PCR, this quantitative PCR, that if you just get down to a basic virological count, it's still 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000. HIV in 1 to 1 in 1,000, 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000 T cells.
It is. No, there's very little of what they call HIV, and what's been brought out here by Philpott and Isai already the measurement for it is not exact at all. It's not as good as our measurement for things like apples. An apple is an apple. You know, you can get something that's kind of like, if you got enough things that look kind of like an apple and you stick them all together, you might think it is an apple. But and HIV is like that. Those tests are all based on things that are invisible, and the results are inferred in a sense. PCR is separate from that. It's just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what
Also,
it is. But it's not. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that. That's why it's not.
So even if you believe in HIV, it can't tell the difference between virus particles or active live virus. I mean, there's a lot of questions involved in this. Guys, thank you very, very much. I don't know what else I can say, but to let you know that we will hold more events where people can get together. Hopefully not when they're all out of town for the holidays, but when we can have a really, really continuing and a growing movement of people asking simple questions. We don't expect to convert anyone. We just expect to plant the seeds of doubt and concern, because this affects us all, gay, straight, or not. It affects us all. I'm tired of being terrorized. I'm tired of sex equaling death, when in fact it equals the opposite. I'm just tired of having my tax dollars taken to terrorize me and the rest of our citizenry. Guys, I think I owe a thanks to our panel. And also, Laura's going to make an announcement about valet.
Just the valet parking, they want to differentiate between us and everyone else. So everyone write HM on the back of your valet parking ticket, and then they will not charge you. Okay? It's very important if you don't want to pay.
There's a meeting of HEAL that is on a small pink flyer on the table there. We have free meetings every month, and you can come and find out more about this stuff every month for free. It's a Wednesday towards the end of every month in West Hollywood.